To heck with book writing. Writing books sucks. Burn it in the ground. There's nothing wrong with not writing a book, by the way. I actually think, honestly, in these liminal web spaces, there's a serious
Mhm.
question of when you should write a book and when you should not write a book. Because now there's this thing like
Mm.
where, actually, this is an interesting question. There's a few things we've discussed. Is philosophy inherently good? And it seems like the answer is no, or it depends. There's also something
Mhm.
about writing. Oh my goodness, it is Tyler Murphy. How you doing, my dear friend? You doing
Good.
all right, Tyler?
Yeah, yeah, doing good.
Outstanding. It is good to see you. We just started asking, like, we've talked about why philosophy is not inherently good. It could be, it depends. But now a little bit on this question of when you should write a book, when you shouldn't, when writing is inherently good or not. And people just come or go, Tyler, or they do however they want. And usually when someone wants to speak, they just raise a hand or they shoot off a flare, whatever works,
Okay.
Michelle and I. And this is Javier Rivera, by the way, Tyler.
So
So
nice to meet you, Javier.
Nice to meet you, Tyler.
Javier is beautiful, and Tyler and Michelle and I had a wonderful time speaking with Tyler the other day. It was a ton of fun. So Javier, when do you write? When do you not write? What also do you think is a feeling that you shouldn't like that you should stop a book project? I think these are all very interesting. Like also creative types have to deal with this all the time, right? Like when
Mm.
should I write a paper? When I shouldn't write a paper? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think contextually, at least for my situation, it was kind of like it's kind of like a collection of thoughts. So there is really no end to those collection of thoughts. I think I was mainly struggling with the fact that I wanted it to be a bigger book. I've always had gripes with the length of my writing. But I think it's more about kind of like accepting in a kind of brutal way that that's just how I am as a writer. It's gonna be short, it's gonna be not long. So why am I kind of why am I trying to fantasize about it being a longer book, I guess. I guess that's the kind of brutal realization that I came. So then I was just like, you know what? I just push the book out, man.
Sure.
Like I don't think there's ever gonna be a moment of like, at least for me, it could be different for others, where I'm gonna be like, yeah, cool, everything's perfect. Everything's set. I just don't think that's gonna happen for me.
Mm.
Um, so I think it's better just to push it out. And then who knows? Of course, on the topic of like theme for your books, maybe that's when we have to be, I don't know, maybe that's when we sort of self-impose a criteria for like, okay, I think it satisfies the theme. I've exhausted the theme for myself, maybe, but at least with my book that I'm pushing out, it's just a collection of thoughts. Yeah.
I
So,
know. I appreciate you sharing in Emilio. It is good to see you, my dear friend. It's wonderful to see. I think the question is interesting as well. First off, there is no virtue in writing something long. There is no virtue in writing something short. There is no virtue in writing something philosophical. There is no virtue in writing something practical. It all is depending. And I actually think one of the things that can kill the creative act is one, assuming there should be a creative act, and two, the assuming of the creative act according to certain metrics. Like, and actually, I think this is a really interesting question too, because it actually kind of feeds into like, when should you do philosophy? When should you write? When should you, like, there's this kind of motivational question of when are you doing it for the right reason, dare I say, right? And that's, of course, vague, and it's not always clear what that is. But like, let me speak on myself. Like, so I've got like, I've got like a folder that's all the novels ideas, right? And actually 38 of them are not written, and about five of them are. But the five that I did write felt like they were going to kill me. Like the whole thing shows up in the mind, and I didn't even think about how long the novel was going to be or if I should do the novel. It was just there. Almost like the way Don DeLeo describes it is it's like there's this monster baby crawling behind you trying to eat you that you're trying to fight off. And David Foster Wallace like that as well. And it's interesting because actually I would say 95% of story ideas you never write because they don't have the fire. You say, oh, I should write that. Maybe I should. But it never has the right to it. The same goes with like philosophy essays or whatever. Like the high majority of them in the file are never written or different thing because they don't have the They don't feel like they're addressing some sort of situation that has consequences, right? So there's this kind of difference between a feeling of I ought to write that and a feeling of it's like alive, like like explosion sort of just going forth. And it's almost like you yourself have to know if the motivation is the right And the problem is like that's actually difficult because people might have expectations, or what if you disappoint people, or then you feel like, oh, I didn't do the project I was supposed to do. So it actually takes some kind of courage to follow that motivation. In the same way that there's kind of a courage if you know all your friends are reading David Hume and you're like, but I don't have the in reading David Hume. You say, well, I'm not going to read David Hume, right? It's like, no, it's an inherent good to read David Hume. Well, maybe not, right? So there's something here about the phenomenology of motivation and the analysis of motivation that seemed really important for determining if you should create something or not, if you should write something or not. But I would also just say, Emily Dickinson's pretty changed the world, and she didn't write very long things, right? There are many poets or single paintings. It's very important. It really is not quantity. Now, maybe there's an idea, like I would argue War and Peace basically has to be long to be the thing that it is. There are things that have to be long to be the thing that they are, but a thing can be what it is and be that kind of bomb, even if it's short, right? But the question is, what is that thing? And why should it come into existence, et cetera, so forth. I think analyzing all of that is very interesting.
Yeah, and for me, it's like a creative process is interesting and different, like because, for example, when you're creating art, there's like an inherent uncertainty that it will work or it won't, and it's almost a personal thing in the sense that you want to express something, like something wants to come out of you, and maybe people will find it interesting or relevant or useful, or maybe they won't, right? But that's like the inherent riskiness of the creative art, and I think that's and that it's beautiful in its own way, because it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. Because, for example, if we take, for example, writing a book or doing a painting, like you do it not because of any other reason that you want to paint it and you hope that maybe it will impact someone else, right? That's like you create art. But for example, if you are making a business, like you don't make a product and hope that people will buy it. You validate it first, like you talk to consumers, like, right? You should make like another process, and it's a different way of thinking. Like you cannot just go and I want to make this product. It's like, no, that won't work. You have to do customer research and validate, like, and go interviews, and it's a whole different, like you cannot just like and pop out and like this thing and it flops because nobody wants it, and it happens a lot of times. So to distinguish between like an artistic endeavor and a business endeavor, just to like in a different categorization, it's different, because like some people like get confused, like I made this beautiful book and it doesn't sell anything, and it's like because people don't really care about what you wrote, and that's totally fine, right? But if you have the expectation of it being a business when it's art, or you want to make art but you build a business, then you will have like a really hard time, right? But I think if you are clear on what you're building, and then you will feel more at peace with the result, I think. So yeah, I think that's just like an interesting distinction to make.
I like that point, and then I'll give it to Javier. It is very interesting. One must know the thing is that they're doing to determine the metrics according to which they can judge it. I think it's a very good point. If you say, man, my wedding venue is beautiful and everyone should like it, yeah, that doesn't necessarily mean they will if it doesn't have running water, right? There are certain structures, but then of course there's always the issue of selling art that gets in that middle zone of trying to figure out how to meet the customer being true. And that might be why creative business is some of the most difficult, because the metrics are so unclear. Like the metrics are particularly overlapping in ways that become psychologically difficult, right? But in the same way too, there can be a way in philosophy, let's say you're trying to write a philosophical text and you want to be doing it because you want to have fidelity to the truth, But the problem is you don't know what the truth is. So then you're always wondering if you're writing this because you just want the world to think like you, or if you're genuinely trying to get at the truth. So there's a similar ambiguity that arises in the writing of a philosophical text that makes me think about, like, when I worked as a photographer selling photographs at Frozen Glory Photography and different things. There's this fine line between, hey, I know people like pictures of old barns and they sell really well, but I don't like taking pictures of old barns. But if I don't take pictures of old barns, I can't afford the Nikon to take the pictures of the mountain when the lights are coming through the trees. Oh, and so you're doing these sort of cognitive bargaining, which in some respects is wise, but in another way makes you feel like you're cheating or you're doing something wrong. And then you have to overcome the feeling that you're doing something wrong. But then you're like, maybe I'm just self-deluding myself. No, I really am not. So you're always having to do the game, right? And you can see why then people just become pragmatists or business people, because they just like, well, just do the metric. What's the profit? It's just a simple metric, because the moment you introduce multi-metric, you have the interrelation of those metrics that you have to think through, and that's existentially destabilizing. Oh, but if you have a single metric, that runs the risk of totalitarian, steamrolling everything, reductionism. So reductionism is existentially more stabilizing, but reductionism is reductionism. Fullness requires multi-metrics, but that's more existentially unsettling. Oh boy, isn't it great to be human? So Mr. Javier Rivera, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is what I struggle with writing my book. There's always this temptation to fantasize as you're writing your book. I think it always kind of like lurks. It's always there. And I think that's like the tragedy of it, at least. And I talked to Davud. He actually said something very interesting, because I was telling him my gripes about my book, and he's like, nobody asks you to do anything with this book, right? That's what's interesting about it. Nobody asks you to put titles in your book. Nobody asks you to put page numbers. Nobody asks you to do anything for your book. I mean, as long as you know, nobody asks you to even write it. So what are we doing when we decide to do this? And for me, the process now, it really bothers me, because it does feel like dying. But I noticed that I think I would be deluding myself in thinking that if I push the book out, the dying would go away. Because in some sense, like I said before, because the book is a collection of thoughts, it's not finished. So what am I doing when I'm deciding to push it out, in that sense? And that's a question that I don't even have an answer to, per se, as to why. All I know is that I feel the temptation of fantasy will continue to haunt me if I remain thinking like, oh yes, I need the book to be longer. There needs to be more work. There needs to be more this, but there's always going to be more work. There's always going to be more this, whatever this is. So for me, the process is just brutal. And so, yeah, I don't have like I don't think, I mean, I think it's kind of like a Kierkegaardian, like either or, you're kind of screwed in a kind of weird way. I remember I had a lot of friends that they were trying to tell me like, oh, well, why don't you just like why don't you title it an anthology? Why don't you make it more structured? And I just didn't want to do that. I just don't want that. Nobody asked me to do that. And it's funny because there is something about being a reader that we take for granted, that there's going to be a title, that there's going to be sections, that there's going to be this nice coherent order to the structure. In my book, I throw that all out. Actually, I took out every title. Everything is, I think Michelle, because Michelle helped me with it. All she did was separate them with a space. That's it. And but I wanted to feel, I actually I thought about entertaining this idea, like, even the reader should feel the burden of this dying, that actually what you expect from me, you assume. you assume what you expect from me when you decide to read something categorized, titled, coherent, everything in that manner. You assume these things. And I think what feels like dying is that the unbearable part is the burden of our own responsibility that we may have asked or not asked for. And I think the reader also takes for granted this responsibility. So I guess you can say my book is like a dual process of like, I want people to feel the burden of that responsibility of reading, and then also the fact that I also had to bear this burden of responsibility from which I decided to do my book the way I did. But yeah, that's all I got to say.
I love how you have the skeleton in the background. I mean, we know like that's really adding to the atmosphere. That's really good. Not that I would put Tyler on the spot because Tyler's such a tremendous painter, a visual painter. I'd be curious on how he decides what he's going to paint, how he thinks about finishing a project, but I won't make him answer that immediately. But if at any point you'd like to speak, Mr. Murphy, I'm very curious about your own process and different things. I guess for me too, Javier, like there's a few things. Like first off, like there is absolutely the absolute choice where at the end of the day, when you ask questions like, why is it this long? Why is this short? You know how we talk a lot about the difference between good philosophy and bad philosophy? Like bad philosophy in David Hume is the ever why. Why this, why that, why that? And David Hume's like, no, just do it. Like either put it in the shelf and forget about it or just put it out. Like once it gets to the place where the continuation of the work requires a philosophical justification, that's actually bad. Like for David Hume, philosophical justification is what destroys the human spirit. Like philosophy is what defends life, defends common life, the lived experience, and it defends choice and helps you make a choice. But a philosophical justification is when you start getting into the opening of an ever void that just makes you feel sad. And you eternally digress for David Hume. You just enter into an eternal regression. So for me, when I get to a point where I'm like, I don't like, there are so many papers that I saw, it's like, I don't know where this is going or how long it's going to be. And I just stopped writing. And 5 years later, I come back. Or maybe never. I don't know. Or I actually just put it out. It's actually funny. There's a lot of times where people will go stuff like, oh, your Substacks are too philosophical. What if you add more pictures? What if you made them more not horrible to read or something, like long or whatever? And it's funny because I always say, well, it doesn't matter. Like in a kind of positive way. Well, it doesn't matter. Like, you know, there's this kind of Julie way. It's like, well, it doesn't matter at the end, right? And it's like, that's the thing. And there's actually a kind of liberation in that, right? There's one form of it doesn't matter that is why do it. But there's another form of it that is defending the choice. Where you're saying, no, this is how I chose to write it. This is how it chose to come out. Like there was a piece I just put out on the garage metaphor from last net conversation. I'm sure that's more friendly, more reader friendly. It's not so long or whatever, but I didn't write it for that. I just wrote it because the idea was finished the way it was finished. And then it's out. Great. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that it's not as long as the other pieces. It doesn't matter that it doesn't have a million citations like some of the David Hume papers or whatever, right? It doesn't matter. And so I think I guess I find like the doesn't matter or the maybe like the being the negativity, like these things actually can be in service of common life when they're not used as in service of a philosophical justification. Like, why am I doing this? Why am I alive? Well, what are you doing? You're looking for a philosophical basis for life. This does not exist. You know, there is the choice. And philosophy then is honoring the choice or the common life. Once you start looking for those kind of philosophical whys, then you're in trouble. Now, the question of why can be to condition yourself to be in the place to experience an opening or to move into a place. But once it gets into the why isn't the book longer or why do I even do this? Well, now you're looking for a why under the thing versus a why ahead of the thing or defending the choice. And so it's one of the ways I think about it. And I do think that distinction in David Hume between bad philosophy and good philosophy is quite useful for the creative act. At least it has been in my life. Because before that, I didn't know where to use philosophy in the creative act. Do you use it in the justification of the creative act? Do you do it in the content of the creative act? Do you do it in defense of the creative act? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And also it helped me when I started feeling oh, I don't know where this is going, to then put it away and not feel bad about it, or to just put it out and not feel bad about it because it's done. it's finished. And what does it matter? It doesn't matter. There's a certain sort of liberation in the doesn't matter there. So anyway, those are some different thoughts I have for anyone who would like to speak.
Just to push back a little bit on that idea, because like for one part there, I remember being on junior high school, and there's this book called Kiobole, and it's a very particular book. It's I don't know how to describe it. It's not, there's text, but let's say that each page has like a different image or a different design, and then it's written the topic, right? So it's like a very visual book. It was the author, he told like, people don't read, I'm going to make a book that's really interesting for them, very like visually engaging, so they can actually read it, right? And it talks about, and he actually went to the schools, like he gave conferences, and he asked like the girls, the guys, like, what do you guys want to know about, right? And he wrote like from, I don't know, like from masturbation to like family planning to like financial stuff. Like he wrote like in this book, it's like he wrote about everything, right? And it was like a very unorthodox book. And I remember that I like to read, and I read like normal books and stuff, but I remember seeing that, and I was like, that sounds interesting, and I started reading it, right? And I distinctly remember the teacher saying me, why are you reading that book? And I'm like, because I want to, right? And she's like, but why? Because like the things that are explained in the book, you will eventually experience and stuff. And I'm like, I just want to read the book. It sounds like a fun, like there's like this stigma because the book was different, right? It was like, it didn't fit the proper title of book, right? And there's like this, when you go out of the norms, right? If you like, there's like this pushback, but it's interesting because depending on the way you do the change of format, you may get praise or you might get hate, because there's this book in Spanish that's called Rayuela by Julio Cortázar. In English, I just looked it up, and it's like Hotspot or something like that. I've never heard of that name in English. And the beautiful thing is that that book can be read out of sequence, right? Like you can read from start to finish, or you can read like chapters. There's like chapters 2, 7, and depending on how you read the book, it's a different story, right? So that was like a really innovative format at the time, and it has won like literature awards and like praises and accolades. So you can be like something disruptive and earn praise, or you can do something disruptive and earn hate for like the high society, right? So there's like, but I think what's interesting in these both cases, and this is where I push back a little bit, in the sense that it doesn't matter, in the sense that for one part there's these two aspects, right? It's like the internal aspect, the internal motivation, I want to write this thing, and there's like the external aspect, as how is this thing going to be perceived, right? So I that's just like a personal consideration. I think like, of course you can do both. Like you can say like, I this paper, I just made this video like for me, and I'm going to place it out there, and that's it. I'm not going to title properly. I'm not going to make like a nice thumbnail, and you made it and you place it out. And as you said, like, it doesn't matter, right? You just place it out, and it's beautiful and it's fun and it's okay. But at the same time, I think there's kind of an unspoken agreement when someone reads your paper or consumes your video, and it's like, and it's weird because it's like an implicit agreement or contract that neither the author or the consumer like sign. But I think like there's this expectation, like, of course, like books should have titles, for example, right? But then maybe you present the book in a way that you're like, okay, like not having titles like enriched the experience, or maybe it didn't, or maybe like it made something different, right? But I think there's for example, for me to write a book and leave it in my shelf and for no one to read it, I did create the book exists, but it was for me, right? Like I didn't take into account any external anything external because I wrote it for me. But when you do something, it's kind of like a dance, right? Like there's the other person and there's you, and I think you do have to take into account and obviously you can go too far and say like, oh, I want pictures in my articles, and you're like, I don't like pictures, I'm not going to put faces in my articles, and that's perfectly fine, right? You don't have, like, it's a dance, you don't have to cave into all and every demands, because then it's not yours anymore, it's theirs, right? Like they are writing it through you, and that's not the case anymore. But I think there has to be this balance in a way, and I think it does matter how they perceive it, because if not, if not, what was the point of placing it out there, right? So I think it's important if they perceive it and to have some considerations. But I think, but yeah, it's this kind of dance between internal and external, and of course the objective, because you can just play something out there and it's fine and it doesn't matter. But sometimes I think it does, and I think both are beautiful in a sense, you know? Yeah.
That's an excellent comment. And I'll say, I generally believe, having some bias towards sort of a Christian conception of fallenness, is that human beings tend to get everything backwards. So, for example, we tend to apply it doesn't matter when it comes to the craft of art, but then think it really matters when it comes to the philosophical justification for why we even create in the first place, when actually we need to reverse that. Like, we need to put a lot of attention on caring about the craft of the writing and the, like, is there grammar? Does it come across? Is it well written? Is it clear? But then when it comes to why write it all? You know, that is where you take the abyssal choice. That's where you make the absolute choice and say, well, I believe, and you take that leap of faith, that risk. But we as human beings tend to do complete backwards, right? Like when it comes to the editing, I don't need to edit, that doesn't matter. But I need to know the philosophical basis for why writing should even exist, because we tend to do things backwards, right? Now, this is where it becomes very tricky though, because, so for example, you do have to determine what the thing is that you are creating to determine what you should be excellent about in it versus not. So for example, I have concluded that I don't need to do full, like for a lot of the audio summary videos on YouTube, I just use a still picture, right? A lot of people think you'd have way more views if you did like a full-fledged video. Well, the thing I am creating personally is the ideas, is the argument. Therefore, a still picture is accidental to the presentation. It is not essential for the craft of the ideas. Therefore, in my mind, that is not sacrificing the craft, because the thing is the ideas, right? Other people would say, well, you would get more marketing, but then I have to make that assessment relative to what's sustainable for me. If I were to literally make every video a full-fledged video, I would burn out, right? I couldn't do it. So you do a still picture and you say, and if people think that's not as good as it could be, it doesn't matter. That's when you're then using it doesn't matter to self-defend what you're making that you've decided is sustainable and that is honoring the thing that you're concerned about crafting and making excellent. Well, that's when it then comes down to your own personal judgments that you're kind of alone in, right? Now we're back to the abyssal that you have to defend, the clearing in the Heideggerian sense that you have to defend. So then you do get into this Aristotelian question of determining what is essential versus accidental to your work. Like Aristotle would say, what is necessary for the thing to be itself that you should be excellent in, and what are the things that are not? And some people may disagree, right? Because you have the high society, low society, and different things. But then you have to like discern that and then stick to that and do your best. And for some books, having just obviously James Joyce in the last chapter of Ulysses determined stream of consciousness was the best way to have the excellent craft of the female going at the end, yes, yes, or William Faulkner and Absalom. There's no grammar. It's all stream of consciousness. And yet it's excellent in what in another circumstance would be poor, right? So William Faulkner, James Joyce, I can go on, determine, no, this is the way to do it. Or you have like in Heart of Darkness, you have the perspective will suddenly change from the point of view of the narrative or the secret agent. This looks like a mistake. No, actually, relative to what Conrad was doing, this is not a mistake, even though it took 30 years for people to realize this was not a mistake. Or at the beginning of As I Lay Dying, where a character seems to be able to see through a house. Oh, he was careless. Oh, that wouldn't make sense given the location of the house. How is this protagonist able to see through a wall? No, it's actually a hint of the actual structure of the novel. So there's craft, and then some things look like a mistake that are not a mistake. They're actually the excellence of the craft, but then it's all the kind of discernment between those differences. But the point you gave rise to is very, very good. Let me give it to Javier Rivera. And then Michelle, good to see you, my dear.
Yeah, I mean the way that I look at this, questions of the like editing and grammar, I look at it like you're trying to best present um, the otherness of yourself in some ways, you could say. You could say maybe this is why we fixate on like, will people understand what I'm trying to understand? Will, will people understand what I'm trying to understand? Will, does it make it clear? We have a sort of anxiety about the other because we want to be understood. Now, of course, there's always a kind of failure in that. We can never really truly understand the other in that sense. But you could say some of these motives are that anxiety that we want to do, right? I want to make sure that at least when I present my work, that it's all grammatically correct, because that's not how I want my otherness to be presented. It's not a mistake. It's a sort of accidental mistake, not on purpose. And so, yeah, for me is that I think when it comes to like, the questions of like structure and stuff, and like, yeah, you're right, Daniel. I definitely had like that abyssal choice where it's like, well, why write? Why do this? Why do that? And that's when I decided, I'm like, well, I'm just gonna push out the book. I mean, I don't see any reason not to, and I don't see any reason less. But yeah, I think my response, at least when I'm writing, is that um, there's definitely a dance going on, but for me, that dance is when writing is that you want to reveal the brutality of your otherness in some ways. Because there's always that risk that succumbing to the other, like Buber would say, is that you're choosing to annihilate yourself so that the other can feel comfortable, and not feel at home. I mean, will feel at home in what is being presented. So, yeah, for me, it's really about the brutality of the otherness. You could say it's violent doing what I'm doing, always, in that sense. But yeah, I think for me that was like the despair and the kind of like thing, because you're constantly fighting like the impending other that wants to impose, wants to feel at a distance between you with the structure of your work, have titles, these kind of expectations that are expected. So for me, there's definitely a kind of ethics in writing, at least in a sense. But yeah, for me, it's definitely about just the otherness, trying to maintain that brutality of my otherness in my writing, rather than it being sort of a comfortable thing, because it's not a comfortable thing for me. It's not a comfortable thing for me. I feel like there should be something like that, but maybe that's just my bias on that. But yeah.
No, that's wonderful, and I'll give it to Tyler here. And Dimitri, it is wonderful to see you. Your recent Substack was extraordinary. I really, really enjoyed that. Very well written, very clear. I highly suggest it to everyone. And it makes me think, Javier, I'll just say, Max Mackin had that wonderful piece on blood writing, where he talks about going through in the anthology. I really like Max, and he has some wonderful work on that. And it's funny, too, because there is something about the difficulty of writing can be evidence that it should be done, but does that mean that's the only metric you should do because you don't want to do it, or is there something more? It's always very interesting. You have to examine that, and the very fact you have to examine it, one can understand why it's tempting to avoid the creative act, because you just don't want to have to deal with all of those different metrics and possibilities. So I appreciate it. But let me give it to Tyler Murphy. Mr. Murphy, it is good to see you today. Thank you for being here.
Thanks. I just saw that, I guess it says Zach Link on there, which is a friend of mine, but whatever, what's in a name? Yeah, I guess, one of my friends is a really fantastic painter. And I remember a couple of years ago, somebody just asking him while I was around him, like, just that question of why do you paint? And he kind of responded with sort of this like, I don't know. It's what I have to do. It's like the one thing in my life that I just, for some reason, have to do it. And I guess sometimes I have that towards painting itself, but I was jotting down different things. Like it feels to me like I always have to have something in my life that doesn't really make sense from a pragmatic level. So even if my painting career is like working out, I find a way to waste time doing something else, which has sort of been all of this stuff. This listening to OG Rose and stuff. It's just a big, from a certain standpoint, doesn't make any sense. And it's something that I can't really justify to friends of mine, but and people know me as like, he's obsessed with psychoanalytic theory or whatever. And I don't know why. It's actually an annoying thing that I wish sometimes I could just get rid of. But like, as I have in this year, I decided to kind of try to reach out more and more to people like you and Michelle and some of the people over like Mikey Downs at Theory Underground and Mari Rudy earlier this year. And I have to say that there's like an intense nervousness and anxiety, but that I know that is a metric that at least works for me, because I remember even being back in high school and I did a little bit of speech and drama. And the night before we did Humorous Duo, my friend and I, the night before the meets, I just get so tense and anxious, but it was a good kind of anxious that I guess that's one way I think of even things like jouissance. And, Daniel, you and I talked about in our last conversation, this idea of the other within ourselves that we, and that can't really be, brought into the symbolic and the imaginary, but that always ends up showing up, and sort of how can we lean into and almost let the other within us speak through us, and not try to have it all make sense and be perfect. Anyways, thanks for having me. And I get nervous just even being a part of this group. So but it's kind of the good kind of nervous. So thanks everybody for letting me jump in here too.
Tyler, you are fire. Thank you for speaking. And actually, I'm glad you brought that up. That was all really, really good. And I enjoyed speaking with you the other day. And I'll give it to Dimitri and then Chitan. One of the things I think about a lot, like Michelle and I talk about all the time, like there's this emphasis in, say, the New Testament, where the one who fears is not made perfect in love. So if you're afraid to do something, you should do it, actually. But then there's this is where I actually think if we talk meaningfully about emotional intelligence, which I think is a term that's thrown around, but it's not really defined. Like, what's the difference between fear and anxiety, right? What's the difference between fear to versus fear from? Like, there's this whole need to be able to tell the difference between, like, we have a paper called Concerning Epistemology, where if you see a lion outside, like you literally see a lion, you shouldn't go outside. It's not really a matter of fear. It will literally eat you. It's just kind of a thing of wisdom, right? But let's say you look outside and you don't see a lion and you say, what if there's a lion outside, right? Well, now you need to go outside because you're dealing with something that you're imagining, right? So there's a very fine line between fear and wisdom, actually, in some circumstances. And there's a lot of gray zone between that. But really, yeah, like if you're afraid to do something, that's an extremely important indication that you need to do it to work on courage, to step in and to work on that courage. I think Ebert has once said that the meaning of life is courage. I like the succinctness of that phrase. But then there's something about being unwise, right? And you shouldn't be unwise, just walk outside and get eaten by a lion. But I actually think often we'll convince ourselves we're being wise when we're being fearful. We'll tell ourselves, oh, I'm actually not a good actor, so I shouldn't go on the stage, so it's wise for me not to do it. Oh, I don't have anything of value to say, so I shouldn't speak up in the conversation. No, you're actually just calling fear wisdom so that then you feel better about being afraid, right? But this is what's very interesting to me, and then I'll give it to Dimitri and Chitan. You said, I really love what you said also about the vulnerability stuff. There's something there that's really important. What's so interesting about the creative act is that it actually opens all of these questions. Like, you literally have to like think about the difference between different kinds of fear to kind of examine, why am I doing this versus not, because of the abyssal nature of the choice. Whereas sometimes in just kind of everyday living life, it can kind of conceal itself if you make the wrong choice. But in the act of writing, since you're so alone, like it really kind of comes out to you on what is the difference between those things and why am I even doing that. So that kind of examination of emotion seems to be something the creative act forces upon the individual, that I'm not saying other acts don't. Perhaps relationships, love, who you're going to marry, these things do as well. But there's something about, to me, the creative act is useful because it helps make clear what emotional intelligence actually is. And I think way too often we conflate emotional intelligence with empathy. We say, oh, you have emotional intelligence because you're empathetic. Obviously, a part of emotional intelligence is empathy, but there's also this ability to tell the difference between these shades of gray, between a fear that is something you should face versus wisdom versus something you're calling wisdom that's actually fear that you're calling wisdom so that you can avoid facing it. Like that's kind of, I think, such an important topic that you brought out there that I really like. I like also what you said about vulnerability, but let me give it to Dimitri and then Chiton. Dimitri, I like your background. And again, I enjoyed your Substack article.
Yeah, thank you. That was nice to write. Usually when I write, I'm also fasting because I'm some kind of Neoplatonist, and I believe I don't remember which one it said. I know Plato said fasting was healthy, and I just kind of dogmatically decide to believe that for the sake of its self-grounding. But it's not edifying at all, if it or grounding at all. And I think that's also why it's such a great thing, because when you fast, well, you just kind of suffer when you are hungry. You get those moments and you're like, oh, I'm just hungry and I can't focus. But actually, I've been practicing fasting. I do it every week. I fast for a few days for like 24 hours. So I have like one meal a day, right? And then it really helps me to read and write. It's funny because it doesn't help me to be social at all. Actually, I can get pretty hangry or grumpy because of fasting. I don't usually I don't really desire to talk to people when I'm in a certain period of my fasting. But yeah, no, with writing and reading, it works tremendously, and it's kind of strange actually. You know, like what is the thing about you're hurting yourself, your stomach, and then the way I perceive it is like you kind of start getting more of a tunnel vision into the very thing that you're doing, and then it's just like you bring out the drive, you bring out the drive, and I'm very much interested in the drive. Just today I was reading some Zizek, and he was saying that actually things like jouissance, the drive, the object A, these weren't really thought by Hegel, and I think he really nailed it on the head right there, because recently, as I've said in some net conversations too, I've been interested in what are the psychological presuppositions of the science of logic, in especially present, not in mediating purely metaphysical categories like quantity, quality, essence, those things, but like before that, why would you even go into mediating those categories dialectically? And then so Hegel says that it is the loftier business of logic to raise spirit to truth and freedom. So Hegel basically believes that, in, let's call it like in normal daily life, we're in a continuous conditioning of subject and object. We have like, for example, me and my cigarettes. That's a pathetic example. But food, dealing with all these kinds of mundane things, sensuous. But we're in immediate unity, like oftentimes I smoke a cigarette and then when it's like almost over, I'm like, damn, like I didn't even notice that I was smoking it. And yeah, if it's a good day, I won't light up a second one. But the thing is, like, these things are super transitory, and obviously we cannot find any edification there, even though we kind of believe it. But then, we do the thing, then we look back on it and we're like, oh, damn, that like trying to fill up emptiness, that thing that I thought was gonna fill up some emptiness actually was empty in itself. But we can actually go beyond this for Hegel, and it's really like only in love that we can go truly beyond this. But it starts in a sense, love is the most supreme actualization of liberation, of spiritual liberation as such. That's the case for Hegel, at least. Of course, this is not liberation conceptualized in a way that you're just getting rid of all kinds of ways of being confined or all kinds of external determinations. No, it's something else. It's a concrete freedom that works with being in actuality. My point, though, is that for Hegel, freedom starts somewhere, and it starts at withdrawal. For Hegel, it starts when you move away from instinct, when you move away from having to sense something. And you know, most of us all the time, we have to sense something. we actually kind of hate to think. Well, we have another way to kind of avoid to think, but kind of pretend to think, and this is what Hegel calls representation, you know. And representations aren't really bad as such, you know. For example, like take the Christian religion. For Hegel, there's this notion of like the immortality of the soul, the Holy Spirit, you know, the Father and the Son, and these are all for Hegel representations. And he says that these are actually they contain truth, but from within religion you cannot comprehend this truth. You can represent you can represent it, and there's definitely something to that, but you cannot think them truly. So what does it mean to truly think? I like this thing that Heidegger once said, that to think is actually to take notice of the fact that you're not thinking. And that's there's something to that for sure. But there's also like okay, in a sense, Hegel is quite Neoplatonist or Platonic, even in the in this idea of like what is his psychological presupposition for the science of logic, because he wants to purify spirit and raise it to truth and freedom, right? So we move away from the senses, we move away from an attachment to external, sensuous, material, degenerative, transitory reality. Well, is that really possible? First of all, second of all, what about like relapsing into the conditioning of subject and object? Isn't that always going to happen? And when you read Hegel in his paper on love, he does say that, you know, yes, you can be liberated in love, but then again, let's say that you find your life partner, then you still have to deal with all kinds of external external necessities. The thing is, though, like Hegel, he does talk about the drive. He also talks about enjoyment, which is interesting in and of itself. Let me just see, I wrote this down somewhere. So yeah, for Hegel, he has this quote that he says that spirit enjoys the absolute idea. And it seems like kind of spirit is kind of getting a circular enjoyment out of this. I kind of brought this out in a certain way in my latest article. The way drive is conceptualized by psychoanalysis is very interesting. One of the ways it is that you know those old LP players where you have like a needle and then you put it on the plate and then it spins around? Well, Zizek says that the drive is basically when you get like a scratch on the LP player and then you just continuously hear the repetition of that same half a second of music. Like to me, like when I for example wrote my recent article and I was fasting and stuff like this, I mean what I'm doing there is like I'm trying to be with that drive and let it all come out. And the thing is, though, that with this, to let it come out and to let the other speak through me and let things come, I first have to self-empty. In other words, I would say that what is this self-emptying exactly? It's not so sacred as it sounds. It's just like, the way I read it, it's just like submission to transference. So in other words, the way Hegel describes thinking is that you do not bring external things arbitrarily or spontaneously. You let thinking run its own course. So your job, to put it in this way, when you try to think, is not actually to actively come up with all kinds of things. That's not thinking for Hegel. That's not thinking. That's bringing in all kinds of abstract representations, images, these kinds of things. Thinking is actually a process whereby you have to submit your body to the drive, which is the other speaking through you. Now, of course, when you're reading something, you have to actively read, always make notes, underline things. And in this way, you can let the author in this case, speak through you. So you can in turn let that other, which is probably some kind of pandemonium of voices, speak through your hands when you're writing an article. And I think pandemonium is a good word here, because it's like pandemonium means like full of demons, something like this is the etymology. So you have to let this other is not some kind of substantial other that is a one and then you just write it down. No, it's like, and first of all, it's a neurological mess, it's a mess of demons, but there's still a simplicity to it. And the magic is to stay with the fact that you have two hands, and that the way that sentences work is that you have to say one thing at a time. So in really trying to think, that's the way I read and I write. You don't try to bring in a lot of factors, but you have to let the notion become other to itself in a simple form. Now, a very concrete example here that I absolutely love is that Zizek talks about the ambiguity of Lacanian terminology, especially the big other. Now, the big other can actually mean a lot of things. You can conceptualize it in different ways. And one of the things that you could do is to, for every different way that you conceptualize the big other, you make a different category. So you say big other 1, big other 2, big other X, big other Y. And he says this is exactly what we shouldn't do. The way I read this is that if we would do this, we would fall back into representational thinking, what Hegel calls the understanding, and it would actually be a stoppage of thinking. What we should do is let this notion, with its ambiguity, with its contradictoriness, with, I guess, the pain of that negativity which this notion entails insofar as we don't understand it and it implies some kind of unknowing, this is how we should write about it in its simplicity and let the notion become other to itself. And this is exactly the way I'm treating love in the way I'm writing it for the Science of Logic anthology. So I'm not saying, yeah, there's eros, there's agape, there's philia, and there's all these kinds of love. I'm just saying the word love, and it could mean different things. Like it could mean friendship, family, and romantic partners. But I like the ambiguity, and the fact that love is massively ambiguous, you can pin it down with like retaining the ambiguity in one word instead of trying to make ossified, rigid distinctions. So yeah, and like I've said many times, for Hegel, love is the most immense contradiction. So that's I think a worthwhile endeavor, even though I would say that agape does have some kind of something to it. To make a distinction between eros and agape, like political love or love in a communal sense, does have something to it. But I digress.
That is lovely, and for you to speak so Heideggerian when Mr. Luber shows up was extremely kind of you, because so a few things, and I'll give it to Chetan, Mr. Luber, and then Javier. There's absolutely something about like where Heidegger talks about thinking as the letting. You create a clearing and then you let. Whereas if you're just coming up with something, then you're building, and that's very problematic. And I think actually this speaks on this question of when should you create something and when shouldn't you create something. If it feels like you're just building, coming up with something, as opposed to letting be, like Thomas Wynne will say, letting something come forth, then you have a problem. That would be an indication you probably should not do it. And often actually a lot of fear that we should lean into is the fear of letting. We actually often will build and represent out of fear because then we're not vulnerable. So there's something about the letting that actually is facing fear, and that's the correct mode of the creative act. And actually fasting is a lovely example because that's creating the clearing. I personally find exactly what you say. You should not eat as long as possible in the creative act because there's something about the agony that is the clearing that then lets the creative act occur, actually. And this is one of the ways, because When you don't just eat when you feel like it, you know eventually you're going to have to eat, but you're saying not yet. And the not yet, just like boldly saying I'd rather not to, is the freedom, right? You're saying, I know I'm going to have to eat eventually, but not yet, dang it. And thus you turn the determinant, the language I use in that Hegel's justification of Hegel fable is you turn the determination into a necessity. You will have to eat, but it is not going to determine what you do. It's a necessity, but also it is a necessity in the sense of your denial of it now actually is that act of denial is necessary for the clearing in which the letting occurs. So it's necessary in the sense that it's inevitable, but it's also necessary to be there so you can deny it to create the clearing. Because it's almost like what I find happens when you deny the food with fasting. That's actually then opening instead of just letting your instincts of eating take over, you're blocking the hunger to let the creative act go forth. It's like you stop one to unleash the other. The fasting is the making of the clearing, and then the letting be is the letting, in the Heideggerian sense, to use that language. Likewise, by fasting, you're turning food from a determination into a necessity. And in that mode, you're then able to let in a far better way. Like you mentioned, it's inevitable that you're going to use the subject-object divide, basically because you have to think. But the difference is not yet. No, not right now. You have the ability to not always think according to the subject-object divide. And when you do eventually use it, you're able to say, I'm only using this because I'm finite and have to, dang it. Likewise, when you eat food, you're like, hey, food, I showed you who was boss this morning, buddy. I didn't eat you first thing. So yeah, I'm eating you, but you know your place, dang it. So I think that's a wonderful example because in my experience, that dynamic is absolutely at play in the creative act. And again, one of the reasons why the creative act seems to be such a good gymnasium is precisely because it opens up even thinking about clearing, fasting, all of these kind of fighting drive, the relation with drive in the same way that it opens up emotional intelligence. It seems to be this gymnasium that brings forth all of these different things that otherwise you wouldn't encounter. I also find making the room as cold as possible to the point that it's miserable is actually good as well, but I digress. Let me give it to Chetan and then Mr. Luber and then Javier. Chetan, it is good to see you, my friend.
Same here. Wonderful discussion. I love the discussion of writing processes, actually. It brings out a very different side of everyone in that sense. I'm not exactly a writer. I write for my academic bread and butter. Apart from that, I have like a lot of unfinished write-ups in my laptop, which would never see the light of day, I think. And other than that, you write for Facebook, Orkut, and those kind of things. I think there's something very interesting, I think, which came before, and I would like to start the discussion from there. I think the question of how do we decide what others would read what we are writing of? There's always a problem in that sense that whosoever has their bread and butter attached to writing faces in that sense. People like us who need to sell what we are writing in one form or the other, we would face that kind of a problem. It's essentially a question of value. If you think about it, it's a problem of thinking about how does something that you do in complete isolation find its value, and value has this whole problematic from labor theory of Marx down to non-subjective theories of current economics and so on and so forth. And value is a complex problem in all of our history, of economics and so on and so forth. But specifically vis-a-vis the creative act, it finds a very interesting contradiction. The contradiction is that creative act essentially is an act that is done outside the world that you recognize as the world in that sense. It can never be completely in that world. There's something about the creative act that never can take the given world as it is, for whatever reasons, and we can ask those kind of questions why and no. And especially writing in that sense is a very privileged form of sort of problem in that sense, that Derrida recognized it rightly, that writing or text, as he said, we normally think speech to be superior to writing. Speech comes first in writing. But speech essentially is done where the plurality of men, where other men are immediately given to us. I can only speak when I know my listener to be there immediately there. Writing, on the other hand, is extremely lonely in that sense. The writing you have to do in company of others without the other being there. There's an interesting problem that writing poses, which is why it sort of becomes there does maneuver over there becomes very interesting in that sense that you have to write and writing essentially is lonely in one sense. Yet you don't call it lonely, you call it solitude, because you know that others are still present there. And that is where I think question of big other would come in, and we can ask that kind of a question: what does big other has with the symbolic space in that context? But writing essentially is an act which is, and it is that kind of an act then which has to find value in the world. And as you rightly said, that value cannot be reduced to any market logic for precisely that reason. Most of the time, many times writing finds value 100 years, 50 years down the line, and nobody can really do anything about it in that sense. And most of the times we judge great writing by how it stands the test of time, how it finds home in a completely different context than where it was written. It's not simply that the writing value is that in the context which it was written, it found this great home or not. No, many times great writing finds home in completely different context than where it ever done in that sense. And then we can't escape that, because writing essentially develops in conditions where its immediacy, and as Dimitri was saying, the instinctual chord of it cannot find this complete hook. The instinctual chord gets broken at some very fundamental point. So I think the question then becomes in that context, and I just sort of stop here because I'll talk too much. But the question becomes that what kind of an other we are facing in the writing there? What is the nature of that other? And even if you think about, say, Lacan's big other within that framing, and you think about this problem of that Lacan's big other lies within the symbolic domain. He's very clear about that. And if you ask what is that problem of big other, and you may associate with big other, actually primarily three things: language, rules, and authority. All of these three things sort of forms a good kind of a mesh with big other. If you think of all of these three things, they stand in opposition to what you may call the gap, the unconscious, whatever word you want to use it. That because you have a structural negativity in place, the other side of it becomes the, and language always in some senses finds some kind of identification of the axis of the big other. As long as you are a speaking being, you have some kind of identification on that axis in the Lacanian frame. The question becomes, what is the nature of that identification which gets invoked in any kind of creative act? What is that concrete symbolic problem that sort of, all writers have to emerge from and walk through in that sense? What is that relationship all about? I don't think there are good answers to it. And I personally definitely do think that big other is a very mysterious concept in Lacan. I think normally a lot of us use it as a crutch, as something which fits the missing puzzle. But if you think it's a very mystical thing. On one side you have this unconscious, and you want to say it's on the surface, it has no, it's an absolute gap and which can never be overcome, and so on and so forth. And immediately on the other side, you need to conceptualize a big other, which does all the things the gap cannot do. There's something about that it actually fills the, it is doing all the things that the gap can't do. And there is this debate where Lacan would say that, unconscious is language, and then he would say, no, unconscious is structured like a language. There is something about that question of what does the symbolic domain encounter within itself that doesn't really break it away completely from living amongst other men, but those other men are not immediately the world that we live in, and how do we think through that? I think. Sorry for taking too much time. Thanks.
No, please. That was an outstanding comment. I'll give it to Mr. Luber, Javier, and Dimitri. And so first, I agree with Javier that we need to have a anthology of your Facebook posts because they're outstanding. And second, when you do write, it's magnificent, like the piece in Nietzsche. And third, I don't know about you guys, but the big other that I'm fighting is a 3-foot hobgoblin with Easter egg-like ears that I try to knife as I'm writing. So mine is a hobgoblin that I'm trying to attack. I'm not sure. But actually, the question of the nature of that other is outstanding. I'm also very taken by this distinction between lonely and solitude. It makes me think of why so many people go to write in a coffee shop or they go write in a bustling like downtown, because they want to feel like their loneliness, their solitude. They want to, it's almost like that helps you feel like you're in solitude versus lonely. You're doing this isolated act, but you look, oh, there are other people around. Whereas if you're alone in the office, sometimes the solitude starts to slip into loneliness. So it's interesting to think about that. I'm also, it's interesting too, because like this big other, like Dimitri was saying, and I think you're correct about the big other or the concept of love. Like if you define it too much, for Heidegger, the clearing shrinks and it's no longer a clearing, and thus you can't have the letting. But if it's too open, it's not a clearing, it's a field. Right. And so there's this kind of underfitting, overfitting, and computer science we talk about. You're looking for this right where big other is defined enough, but not so much that there can't be any letting. Or you want to have a concept, like you were saying with Zizek, like you have these concepts in Lacan that do have a meaning, but it's not so designated that there can't be any letting. That I keep using this kind of movement, which is very interesting. And the last thing I'll say is now I'm wondering if in the same way fasting is where you tell food, yeah, I know I need you, but not yet, not yet. And that allows the letting. Is there something about writing in the loneliness that you say, yeah, I know eventually I'm going to have to go in society. I know I'm going to have to see people, but not yet. Not yet. And so then your social interactions move from determinations to necessities. Therefore, your social interactions become things that exemplify freedom in the same way that eating through fasting becomes something that is necessary for freedom. So it goes with social interactions. So it goes also, maybe that's also too with this thing of, yeah, I know I'm going to eventually need to sell my art and make money. There's a point where I may need to do it, but not yet. Not yet. I'm not going to come out the gate writing a book to sell it. If the day comes where in order to keep writing, I have to sell it, well, we'll worry about that then, but not yet. Not yet. Where there's something about the creative act all throughout it, which is the not yet, that then defines it as this kind of gymnasium of freedom. There's all these opportunities to say not yet, thus transform determinations into necessities, to use my language. And maybe then the big other, maybe you could say it's death, where you're like, yeah, death, I know I'm going to die, but not yet, dang it. I know entropy's going to win, but not yet, dang it. Or it's like, okay, truth, I know ultimately you're infinitely greater than anything I can ever come up with, but not yet. I've got some more to say. There's a kind of not yet that's kind of coming in, that in that not yet, there is an ultimate humility. Maybe we can even say negativity in the kind of Julie Rest sense, where it's not too therapeutic. But it's also not a doing nothing, right? It's like a not yet. Like you can say, well, in the end, guys, if you're ultimately going to eat, why even bother with fasting? It's like, if in the end, you're ultimately going to go hang out downtown, why bother with solitude? Because there's value in the not yet. The not yet creates the possibility of freedom. And so there's a value in that, in the not yet, which then could be the clearing to allow the letting. But let me give it to Mr. Andrew Luber, Javier Rivera, and then Dimitri. Mr. Luber, it is good to see you, sir. How you doing?
I'm doing well. It's good to see you guys. This is an incredible conversation that I just jumped into. Holy shit. So bear with me. I tried Molly for the first time last weekend. Okay. And everything I'm going to say is going to tie into the, I know, very unlike me.
Molly.
But it was a completely different, I'll just say this real quick and then I'll come back to it. Because I think, believe it or not, a lot of what we said is related to understanding the Molly experience. So I'll just say this about Molly. Your complete orientation in your life world changes, the medium itself changes. Like, I would like to say that the medium is more primordial. It's not even language, it's vibration itself. Language seems to be a byproduct of this primordial vibrational dimension, if you will. But let me get there for a sec. Let me make my argument real quick. So with what Dimitri was saying about representation, it was really interesting to me because Heidegger talks about representation being truthful insofar as it is directly related to being itself, that it's representing a position of being. It's from an ontic standpoint, it's truthful to what being is trying to express. However, ontologically speaking, it might not capture the essence of what the representation is coming from. So with that said, your Heidegger quote about if you're not thinking, like, you're thinking when you realize that you're not thinking, what he's getting at with all this is that to see past the representation, to actually be thinking, in other words, it has to be purely provocative, and provocative in the sense that every moment of the experience of the thought, or how one understands the representation, has to be understood in a way that every aspect, every feature of that experience is in question on whether it is necessary for it to be part of that experience. And if you are looking at the ontological roots of every aspect of the quote unquote thought, you're automatically at a position where it's like, wait, am I even thinking? Wait, is this even a representation? Wait, is this, it's simultaneously present, the aspect of the experience, while simultaneously undermined, it's put into doubt. And you have to work through the simultaneity of the presence itself and the doubting of that which is present. So that then leads, I forget who talked about ambiguity, but that simultaneity of the doubt of that which is present and that which is present itself. That is what he means by ambiguity. Ambiguity points to the fact that being is present by the fact that there's a difference in which being is expressing itself. The representations, the way in which one is provoked by the ambiguity. Sorry, I lost my thought. It's ambiguity. The fact that there's ambiguity points to there being something actually there. And the only way to know that something is there through the difference of the ambiguity. So that ties into like why, representation is partially truthful, partially not truthful. And the partially truthful, not truthful is the very provocative nature of thinking, which points to there being, because the provocative nature of thinking points to an inherent ambiguity in understanding and experience. And when I say experience, I mean the thinking process, any type of worldview focus on something. When on the Molly experience, so with the Molly experience, you're inherently, your thinking, your experience is filtered in a way where you can only understand vibrations. You can only understand how you are literally embedded in the environment, and language itself couldn't even articulate it. Like, people will just say euphoric, they'll just use like these like crude stabs at what Molly is. People say like, because when you take Molly, your serotonin goes up and you're at like the happiest state you could possibly be. I would say that you can't even say that you're in a happy state, because a happy state is something that's psychoactive in the sense that you have to be able to describe with language that this experience is a happy one. You can't even describe things in the Molly experience because you are just purely feeling the experience. So it's inherently provocative because when you come out of the Molly experience, because you kind of like fluctuate in and out of the experience, you're inherently reflecting back on like, whoa, what the fuck was that? And then it happens again, and you're being thrown into this like contraction, if you will, of like a pure negation sublation in like a real experiential sense, because you're looking at this experience that you're in, and you keep you see the ambiguity. You see the ambiguity, and like that is part of the appeal of it. And then just a few remarks on like lonely and solitude. Solitude to me just captures a dimension where it's just like you being with yourself. Loneliness seems to be a description in which like you could be lonely in your solitude. And with that said, I feel like when you're on Molly, it's like you're just purely in solitude. You can't even have the possibility of feeling lonely or happy in your solitude because you're stuck in just the solitude, in the vibrational, in that primordial dimension. And you can't, like, I just remember dancing and just like touching myself so much that I was just like, and like smiling. Like, that's all I remember, really. It was just like purely me being in like in my own world. Yeah. And then Chetan, you were saying some very interesting things, but I would have to hear the question again to really like lay out my, like, just word vomit my argument. But the missing puzzle that fits the creative process to me is theme. Theme is that walks that fine line of it being a field and it not being a field, to use Daniel's language. It's the boundary conditions to an experience is what I would say. But yeah, I mean, I'm gonna stop talking. Oh, one more thing. Daniel's notion of the not yet. I think it's incredibly difficult as an individual to do that. So I kind of, in my mind, advocate surrounding yourself with people that inherently do the not yet with you. So like I have a writing partner that Daniel knows very well. He's a very much not yet Andrew. No, Andrew, don't do this. There's this constant conflict, this constant arguing, but it's not like a bad arguing. It's a good arguing insofar as it's pushing us toward goodness. It's not arguing for the sake of arguing. It's arguing for the sake of getting to that not yet, for the clearing, for us to both see what needs to be the case. So yeah, it would be interesting to tie that into like a loving relationship, and like the loving relationship is necessary for you to see the good within yourself. That the loving relationship forces the not yet, which forces you both to see the good. But yeah, that's basically, there's a lot of good things said, so it's hard to keep track. But
well, I'll just jump in and say, and then I'll give it to Javier, Dimitri, and Chetan, because Chetan was asking about what is this other that when we're in solitude of the creative act that we're writing for or toward? Like, what is this big other, like this audience that one is writing to in solitude? And and that actually is an inherently ambiguous state, and would also speak to a sort of theme, because you're trying to write to this audience according to the theme that you think that they would align with. So these things can go together. But I will say it sure sounds like Waffle House has expanded their menu with Molly and all. I tell you what. Or is that like a new dessert that goes with the blondie at Applebee's? You got the blondie and then you got the Molly. I'll tell you what, they're really making it happen. I'll say also quickly that William Epson wrote a lovely book called 7 Types of Ambiguity, and basically argues that great art is always ambiguous. And by ambiguous, he does not mean not able. The problem is we use ambiguous as a simile for unclear. as in it is unclear. For William Epson, ambiguity is more like a Schrodinger's cat, honestly. It is a state of a kind of bothness, and the only way there can be a bothness is if there's a thing there to be the bothness, or so it's always kind of pointing beyond itself, right? So it's not unclear. So like great art, like great poetry has an ambiguity to it, not because it is, yeah, there are parts of Wallace Stevens where you have, I have no idea what's up with this snowman, but that's not really the thrust of it. There's an ambiguity that's being pointed beyond. And I do think there is something about the state of solitude that is an inherently ambiguous act. Who am I writing to? Who is the audience, right? Likewise in fasting, when am I going to eat? Maybe I don't need to eat. I've heard about people who fasted for 10 days, dang it, maybe I can do that. Or like there's this question of, I'm going to die. Well, I don't know when I'm going to die. I'm not dying yet, and death better bring it, dang it. There's this inherent sort of ambiguity that kind of comes out in the creative act that then may speak to why that mode is precisely adequate or fitting for what the creative act is, which is some sort of testament to the ambiguity. And actually, the not yet is inherently ambiguous because it's like, not yet, like not what? Like it's like there's an inherent ambiguity to the not yet, because it's saying that a thing is coming, but you don't know when, and you don't know if it will come in the way you think it's going to come. And so the not yet it's kind of like a way of life that aligns you ontologically with ambiguity. And in Hegel, freedom basically is ambiguity, because it is that state of knowing that the determinations are coming, but I'm going to relate to them with an ambiguity of choosing when I will eat, choosing when I will give into that determination, and therefore it transforms into a necessity. So you can see in the way that's being so described in Hegel, determination plus ambiguity turns into necessity. Necessity is the clearing in which love, freedom, ergo, these things can come out, of which the creative act can, even if someone doesn't realize it, train people to be aligned with that ontological horizon by virtue of what happens in creativity. Given all the things you have to face, given that everyone thinks you're crazy, given that you're like, well, if in the end I'm going to die, what does it matter? It's like that question of like, if we're all going to die, what does it matter? And then we watch the movie 300 with King Leonidas and like the underdogs or like Chariots of Fire. It's because of what Plato said. It's about the good death. We're going to die well, dang it. Like we're going to yeah, we all know we're going to die, and we all know we're going to eat. We all know we're going to try to represent things and miss a lot. You also said a lot about representation. Like, there's the not yet in that. It's like, I know that the story I write will not be as good as my idea of the story. I know that the painting I'm going to paint is not going to be as good, but I'm not going to like give up yet. Not yet. Until it's finished and I can't paint anymore, and then it has to not be as good as I thought, I'm going to say not yet, not yet. Representation will fail, but I'm going to be excellent at the crafting of that representation and not give in yet, not yet, not yet. And that's the absolute choice. That's the courage we've talked about in a lot of net conversations. And so the not yet is, you could say perhaps that philosophy is the art of the not yet that comes out in the creative act. And that creative act is the practice of that not yet. And again, I think like to me, when I read about Plato saying like the good death, like the point of life is the good death. The key is the word good. That's a life that is committed to the not yet. And that's one of the big differences. But let me give it to Javier Rivera, Dimitri, and then Shitan.
Oh man. Yeah, I mean, I agree with Andrew, and to the extent that how do we not succumb to the fantasy that we've done the not yet? How do we not succumb to the fantasy that I am not thinking, that I am thinking, that I am behind the representation? These are, to me, like all tempting fantasies. Even the idea of I finally turn something to necessity. Like I just see it's difficult to not believe in our tricks, I believe. And I think this is like, for me, the most tempting thing. When we when we speak, make distinctions. One thing that I liked about Luther was that when he said that when you ought to, just because it says that you ought to, doesn't assume that you can. It doesn't assume that we can do it. And I think for me, if I were to give anything about necessity, is that it's the brutal thing of one cannot help oneself anyways. One is doing it because one cannot help oneself to do it anyways. For me, that's like the brutality of the necessity, that I'm doing this because really I can't help myself but to do it anyways. And maybe that's the mysterious otherness that Chitan is alluding to when we talk about why is it that one cannot help oneself to do anyways. Maybe there is something of that submission in there to the other that we perceive as our symptom, our pathology of some sorts, that we cannot help ourselves. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not even sure if like I would even want to entertain the terms of like thinking and not thinking. I'm not even sure, if I'm being honest. Mainly because I feel, for me anyways, it succumbs me to the fantasy of like, if I do this in this way, I am not thinking. I am thinking. And for me, that's always the danger, because I start believing in the act of what I am doing is thinking or not thinking. But for me, it's a tempting fantasy for me. But I'll leave it there.
So, there's a bunch of things, and then I'll give it to Dimitri and T-Town. So first off, if you're looking for the not yet in your thoughts where you say, I haven't, not yet to yourself, no, it comes from the experience of your bank account not having money in it. It doesn't come from an idea. It comes from the rejection of your neighbor who thinks you're wasting your life, and you feel the emotions in it, and you're tempted to give into that feeling and just do something that everyone else is doing, because then your neighbor won't make you feel bad. It comes from the feeling of, oh, if I had another job, I'd make more money and didn't have to deal with the anxiety of not being paid for my bills. What David Hume warns is, if you try to look for the justification in philosophy, you enter philosophical melancholia, which is a state where you are unable to find a basis for your life, and you are always stuck in fantasy. And in that state of fantasy, you can then try to have philosophical resentment for the inability to find a philosophical basis for what you do. And that's when you go into power, become a philosopher king, and conform the world to your vision so that you can escape that philosophical melancholy, because you have made the world into your image and likeness. And David Hume says, no, you are to look for the basis of your philosophy in the feeling of your bank account being empty. You are to look for the basis of your philosophy on unloading trucks or folding tables and all of these things that are difficult to do, that have no status and seem like you're wasting your life and don't pay very well. And you are tempted in that moment to give up the way of life that you have chosen, or to give it in the creative action. And it is in that moment, there is no fantasy. You can't pay your bill. There is no fantasy. You feel as if you are wasting your life. There is no fantasy. You are rejected by your community. And in that state, you say, not yet. That is not a fantasy. That is an act of courage. And that is the life of the common life that David Hume says. And that is from the place that good philosophy is possible, but it must be in that place of facing the neighbor, the determinations that in the state of the not yet, when facing that anxiety, now it can turn into a necessity and the possibility of freedom in the free act. But indeed, one must be careful to look for philosophical justification, because not all that is ever done for people is led them into the philosophical melancholia that ends up being a snake eating its own tail, auto-cannibalism. But let me give it to Dimitri and Chitan.
There's this article I wrote, Andrew. I just did it. I love drugs, by the way. I love Molly too. I think it's a fantastic drug. Only problem is when I've not taken so much Molly, because every time I do it, the 2 days afterwards, I just get so utterly depressed. I get so suicidal. So that's why I don't like it so much. But I wrote this article that I just sent the link of, and this was inspired by my experience on ayahuasca. Euro accent. Fucking hell. So I mean, I know what you're talking about. I know all those vibrations, I've been there, I've been feeding into them. They don't tell me so much. You're right. They are pretty silent. But they're very much overflowing. But is it the case that this is more primordial than language, and language is a byproduct? I would beg to differ, as I kind of believe the opposite to be the case. as I've tried to bring out in that article, which, oh yeah, like I said, I wrote a week after this ayahuasca experience, which is like, I mean, if you compare ayahuasca to Molly, it's like ayahuasca is like way up there, you know. But yeah, I think it's the opposite. I think this, what you called the primordial state of the vibrations, which is definitely real. I mean, I've experienced it. I think that's like a byproduct of language. That's basically what I would think. I don't think it's there before language. I think it's because of language and the symbolic order that I mean, we name it, right? And insofar as we name it, it's got something conceptual to it. So, and I definitely think, like, in these types of experiences, whether they are drug induced or are not induced by drugs, because you can get in such a state also if you're just listening to really good music, you know. Like, there's something to this that you can, I believe you perceive the truth of it in the speech of it, you know. So it's not like the intensity of affect, the intensity of feeling, like how fast your heart is beating, that's all fine, but it's like how do you symbolically go about it, and how are you mediating it? Because, like, obviously, like, your worldview and cognition is not set aside, you know, like these types of, I mean, there's a discussion in different schools about this, but like the perennial mystical experience is definitely always already within some kind of worldview. Now, in regards to fantasy, it's this is also like one of those Lacanian words that seem easy, maybe. It's just like, oh yeah, fantasy, of course I know what fantasy is. It's just when I have some kind of dream and I want to achieve something, and then I run towards that direction. That's my fantasy then. But it's not so clear if that's really what Lacan means by it. First of all, because it's not that we have like a lack, we have a desire, and then we go towards the fantasy to get rid of that lack. It's more like, the way I've seen it being written about is that fantasy edifies us by or like has a semblance of edification, because it tells us how to desire, and we actually desire. So the worst state is like to not know where to head, in the sense of not knowing what to desire, right? Which is the truth in some kind of sense. And yeah, Chetan, what you said about, like, to who are you really speaking in your texts? You know, who are you really writing to? I think this is such a good question, and especially if I think back about when I started writing versus how I'm writing now, and how I imagine that if I keep practicing, I'll be writing in the future. Like, I've actually talked about this with you, Daniel, recently, that, you know, when you're writing philosophy, you don't want to bring up something new. You just want to explain what's already there, basically, or address, or whatever kind of language we want to use. And like, but who needs to know that? Right? Like, who needs to know that? And when I wrote this article, I really didn't want to, like, tone it down in simplicity. I didn't really have an audience. I don't really actually, like, my YouTube channel also, like, someone, multiple guests now have asked me before the podcast, yeah, what's your audience? And I never know what to respond, because I don't know, I just like talking, and then just producing it, bringing it out, and then some people like it, apparently. But yeah, the same goes for my writing. I don't really know who my audience is. I don't really feel like I want to have an audience. I don't want to be confined by an audience. And, you know, whereas it's an interesting question today in regards to the internet too, because it's all about audiences, like, and it's all about staging the scene of your primal fantasy, whether it's in, you know, music that you're releasing, or, well, not primal fantasy, but some kind of fundamental fantasy. But yeah, no, Nietzsche talked about the danger of having followers and identifying with them being your followers. So there's to be kind of discussed. I mean, I love what Eminem said. He in one of his early songs, he says like how he's going to keep producing for these fucking retards, and he called all his fans fucking retards. And that's like, that's then you can keep it real. And he said even like, oh yeah, they're just gonna keep listening to this, even if I call them retards and shit like this. I like that kind of we are your audience. Well, that's an honor. Thank you for that. But yeah, no. So the final point about fantasy. The fantasy is not. It's not really like the Lacanian conceptualization of fantasy is not the common sense conceptualization of fantasy, and it's not the idea that we just have our little idiosyncratic fantasies and then we just have to confront the empty reality as it is. That's exactly not what traversing the fantasy means, according to Lacan. In a sense, it's the exact opposite, and you don't really need psychoanalysis to go through this. I think the creative process probably, I mean, the best artists know that this is what the creative process is about. It's traversing the fantasy, right? It's you coming up with a song, completely diving into it, completely identifying with it, being like, this is going to be the project that's there to finish all other projects. And then you release it and you listen back and you're just like, oh, wow, it's kind of shitty, actually. And then you move on to the next thing, because what else are you going to do? It's no use sitting still. So, yeah. Oh, sorry, Luber just asked me something too. Is movement the same as language? That's a good question. I would say no. I would say contradiction is movement and movement is contradiction. And like there's a formula that one Hegelian once said, and that's that the concept is time. Now, what is the concept? An easy way to begin understanding is the concept is like the totality of the self and the world and everything, basically. But it changes as time. It doesn't change in time. It's actually above time in the sense that it's eternal and infinite, but it changes as time. And that's how we see contradiction as movement and different ideas opposing each other. So how Hegel understands edification? Well, I just mean like grounding, like when you stand with your feet on the ground and it feels solid, like then you're like edified. When I pull the rock underneath you, you feel abyssal. That's the way I'm just using this word, just very simply.
No, that was lovely, Dimitri. I'll give it to Chiton, Javier, and then Mr. Luber. Mr. Samuel Barnes, it is good to see you, sir. In fact, we brought up David Hume, so this is lovely. And I should note, to be fair, what Julie Ress is doing with psychoanalysis is very much what David Hume is doing with philosophy, which is the notion that David Hume is concerned that philosophy does not acknowledge that it cannot answer, to use Mr. Barnes' language, the meta question. That ultimately philosophy is trying to escape common life. But what David Hume wants to say is if philosophy doesn't acknowledge that the greatest problem of philosophy is philosophy, then it becomes self-devouring. In the same way that psychoanalysis can become in trouble if it doesn't acknowledge that it itself can be its own problem, right? Like that it becomes overly positive is the language. Here's the issue. What David Hume will say is that therefore philosophy needs to honor common life, lived experience, the concrete, the lived, right? A danger with the language of saying the essential nothingness or sort of negativity is that itself is kind of a philosophical concept, right? You are saying that there is an essential negativity. That's not what David Hume says, that ultimately philosophy is in service of the concrete, that courage and the absolute choice is all based on the actual lived experience that you feel, that the reason you need to do that is precisely to avoid mechanisms of self-deception, fantasy, and different things like that. And in fact, the failure of like thinking to do that is why you need books like Paul Johnson's Critique of Intellectuals, Thomas Sowell, the Vision of the Anointed, Julian Brenda. Like you could say the entire like Ivy League system becomes philosophy or philosophical or intellectual that is not aware of its own problem in intellectualism, right? So it's not negative enough in that sense, right? And so you have to have that critique. But the question then becomes, like we were saying last time, what is the best description then of the basis? by which we think, like thinking from. And to me, I think that's really, really important, because where David Hume would then have you turn from philosophy to common life and the lived community and different things, if we don't have the right language, we might slip into something that becomes more nihilistic, frankly, that becomes some sort of negative, or in the end, like we're all going to die. So what does it matter? Well, because you are alive now, right? And so there's dangers in these descriptions in what it would lead you to conclude from that negativity. And so that would become, I would say, David Hume is a better description in that sense, because I do think that common life becomes what you then have to refer to. But you are more than free to disagree with that. But let me give it to Chetan, Javier, and then Mr. Luber. Chetan.
I just sort of maybe wanted to sort of develop on the problem of the other here in that sense, and maybe respond to what I think Luber was saying. I think one thing with creativity actually is, if you want to simply think about creativity, I think one good opposition is between creativity and calculation. As you know, Bernard Stiegler sort of brings up that creative act immediately gets invoked where you have to let go of the certainty of calculation. Where you do not have the certainty of calculation, you are entering into a field of creativity, whether you like it or not. You know, where you have to deal with that uncertainty, which is why I think when we discuss this opposition with solitude and loneliness, I think it's not really an opposition, because any kind of having a space of solitude or having a relationship with solitude demands looking into the abyss of loneliness, which is why writing can be very difficult. Writing can be very dangerous act. It can really sort of make you your own death, because writing can, before the solitude comes in, writing can be extremely lonely. It's a big struggle with your own loneliness to find that other within yourself. Many people can't even do it. For most people, that experience itself becomes so violent that they can't enter into it. And I teach writing as part of a course in a university, and I know a lot of students who can't write. They will tell me that you tell me what to write, I'll do it. But don't ask me to go into that space. It's too scary for me, because they experience such violence within that space, from which that other emerges, that they don't know what to do with it. And, for most of them, at least in my class, I find that they can't cross that barrier. They will write something for the exams and stuff, but I know what I'm reading is some part of the calculating brain in that sense. They haven't crossed, and some of them really are comfortable with that barrier. They cross it immediately. They are able to, and we can think of a writer's block in that sense, and so on and so forth. I think that's the first point. Hannah Arendt has this very interesting distinction between action, work, and labor. And action basically is action for Arendt when it's done amongst other men. And labor, essentially, when you find and create something permanent in relationship to other men in that sense. And labor is that activity where nothing of permanence is created. And immediately, if you look at it, you'll find labor to be existing on the side of drive to some degree, and action to exist on the side of, some form of distinction, at least early Freudian distinction. Of course, later Lacan, Zizek would alter that problem, but distinction is still very interesting how she draws it. And she says that thinking is a big problem, because thinking as such can be very laborious, because it can completely take you in your loneliness. And thinking as such can make you encounter an other through the process of thinking. And in that sense, it becomes the basis of all action. There is something about thinking. And for her, without action, human beings lose any purpose in life. Human beings have purpose in that sense, to the point that they can engage with plurality. They can engage with other men in that sense. This problem of other in that sense that emerges with the thinking of Arendt vis-a-vis politics. But if you think about it, and it comes down to the problem of big other in Lacan. And as Zizek said it very nicely, whole of Wittgenstein is this playing games with big other of some sort. That eventually, immediately you enter into the problem of language. You enter into a field of the other, which cannot be pinned down to any calculating, any fixed universe, fixed set, because big other is bad. It cannot be brought down to any fixed set. And yet it will always produce its own rules. It will always retrospectively create its own rules. There's nothing escaping that reality. And when you have to engage with that other, with those authority of the other, and that authority exists, whether you like it or not, when you enter into some kind of linguistic domain, you're entering into some form of authority. The authority exists. And when you enter into that question of the authority, and you recognize that the authority itself is consistently incomplete, that means you always have an opportunity to create something from that authority. You can always create a text, create a writing piece, which will find its place in the world in the context that is completely different from yours. But that capacity in that writing only emerges because you're able to engage with this barred other, this incompletion of the other, this struggle with the other in that sense. The question becomes, at least for me, when I think about this kind of a problem of thinking, and I'm not a huge fan of Lacan when you have to think about big. I'm more Wittgensteinian than Lacanian in that sense, to be honest. When I have to think of this problem of the language in that sense, concretely. To me, something very interesting emerges in this dimension of the other, whether you want to call it big other, whatever names you want to give it. This dimension of the other, that essentially and always this dimension of the other is found in a different location, in a different place than you find a relationship with the mechanistic world, with the calculating world. That relationship can never be reduced or found in a simple, which is why when you talk to writers and when writers sit and talk many times, you find that conversation inevitably goes into what is the place you write from. What is that place like? I remember Foucault very nicely said this, and this question of experience, that eventually the problem of experience, and he says, is that there's always something left unexperienced in experience itself. Experience itself always has something which is left unexperienced. And how do you bring that into the foray? I think the only way to sort of bring that unexperienced element into your own experience at all points of time is to actually concretely engage with this field or this dimension, which cannot be reduced down back to any kind of a mechanistic relationship with the world in that sense. And what is at stake in that relationship with that part of your own self, for a society, for a community, and what is the community of storytellers all about? What is the role of storytellers? Walter Benjamin has this famous essay on storytellers. I remember, what is that role of a storyteller? We're all telling stories. And Arendt gets it right. Action demands somebody tell the story of action. There's no action possible without somebody telling a story, because stories is what makes something permanent out of actions. Thanks.
No, I think it's a beautiful comment. I'll give it to Javier and Mr. Luber. I think, one with the Wittgenstein is very, very nice, kick the ladder away, right? And I think there is always something that is missing from experience. And the question is, do we relate to that as an unknown or unknowable? Does it become something that we can condition ourselves to more fail to represent, but also kind of approach? Or not? Does it become something that we choose to be a source of motivation or a source that kind of pulls us down, right? I think also what's very interesting is that with this question of the barred other, there's something about the creative act where the other is always barred that then kind of trains you to kind of be used to living your life before a barred other, something that you can never fully bring into your symbolic order, yet you have to relate to as well. That then when you encounter pluralism, where you encounter people that have different views from you, that you can't assume the shared background, that then that could be a traumatic experience unless you have better training with it. A lot of the problem, so for David Hume, there's the spread of philosophical consciousness, which means civilization now is based on concepts not of how do we get food to the town, but liberty, democracy, equality. There are philosophical foundations for government that then results in people having to be philosophical in their thinking to deal with. And then as you encounter people that are different of other worldviews, you have to go, they really, I always dealt with barred others, but I didn't feel the barred otherness so badly because I could assume that they were Christian or assume they were capitalist. Oh, wow, I really am trying to communicate with something that I can never fully capture. I'm just going to go join my fundamentalist group. I'm just going to isolate. I'm going to go to a strong man, right? So there's something about how to come to terms with the reality of the barred other that the creative act may help one work with gymnastically, so that then when they deal with it socially, they're more able to deal with it in a manner that doesn't have a negative response. And the last thing I'll say is, one of the things I guess I would say is that there's this thing where there's this complete danger where I guess I would say, what is my other that I've been writing to? Well, like, so for example, I write, you know, I see where people are manipulated or controlled by their boss, and they don't have the mental resource, there's a concrete experience, and they don't have the ability to avoid that manipulation. And so they end up living a life or doing something that really hurts them, right? You have that experience and you're like, why did that happen? It's not that you can stop, it's like, why did it occur? And then the thing is, you go and you kind of go through some different things. And one of the things that could be so bad, though, is because people have been so trained to think that ideas are impractical or they don't matter, when then you're talking to the person, they don't want to hear it, or they think it's a waste of time. And then they are stuck in the cycle of repetition, kind of in a psychoanalytical way, precisely because they think it's not going to make a difference, right? Well, they still have to live the next 30 years now doing that job that they don't want to do, or being taken advantage of by the boss, or not being able to see significance in their possibilities, right? And so there's this ditch. What's very interesting and so difficult about this is there's a form of philosophy where you act like it's a good and of its own, and you become the intellectual class that Thomas Sowell and them talk about, destroy the world. And that's what David Hume's trying to correct. But then there's another side of this where philosophy doesn't matter at all, but actually it can defend you, create self-defense between manipulation, help you deal with pluralism, as long as you don't make that philosophy the basis of the justification of your life. You still need to go fold the chairs. You still need to go live, right? So you have this really difficult navigation that has to occur that kind of requires philosophy to think through. Well, that means you're playing with fire to learn how not to be burned by fire. That's really difficult. And what I take Julie Resch to be talking about or pointing out with psychotherapy or psychoanalysis is that you're playing with fire to learn how not to be burnt by fire. So how do we, isn't that like not going to work out? Isn't there some sort of core problem that is really, really difficult, and maybe you can't work it out. Maybe you can never do it. And some people may look at this idea of using philosophy to not fall into the ditch of a life-justified philosophy as fruitless. There's no chance of it, right? Maybe not. Maybe it depends on the individual. Maybe there's a way to do it. But if we don't, the consequences are there, right? The consequences are there. So it's this very delicate thing. But let me give it to Javier Rivera and then Mr. Luber.
Yeah. I mean, Julie's interesting, mainly because, you know, when people ask questions about evil, human rights, you know, her negative perspective seems to be counter to wanting to approach those problems. That's a very common question, actually. But what I've noticed when she speaks is that she's not against either or, because in some sense, she would say, yeah, go ahead, you should. You should, you know, try to eradicate evil in some sense, and you should try to fight for human rights and so on. But she's trying to say that there is a fundamental failure in all of those things. And I think that's why she speaks like a kind of living dead kind of thing. Which, because if you think about this living dead kind of movement, even just accepting the negative perspective, it must also fail too. And so that's why I think what Rashi is trying to get at is the brutality of, or the visceral otherness that we have. Because, like, for example, in my own life, I'm relatively pessimistic about my own siblings' well-being, but I persist doing things that I believe might help him anyways, even though on the inside I'm really, really pessimistic about it. But you could say it's a kind of like brutal compassion. You're like dead, but you still, for me, that is like maybe a more pure love, because now there is nothing, I have nothing, but I'm pessimistic about it, but I still continue to try to help him, and so on. So I look at Julie Resch similar to that idea, but then Julie Resch also looks at the opposite, meaning like we have to pay attention to the fact that what if one can't help oneself anyways? And so this is what we must pay attention to. So it's hard to really say that that there's real disagreement with Julie Resch in some sense, but I would say that for me, we have to be like, I don't like the snake metaphor that much because it tends to pathologize the snake in terms of like there's a normal snake and then there's a snake that is not normal. But you know, and Julie Resch's argument and Supanchik's argument with nature is that nothing is normal. We're all monsters. So how do you deal with the brutality of the other with a snake that is a snake that eats itself? How do you deal with that brutality that one cannot help but eat oneself? And so in some sense, even in the Humean sense, if the goal might be to return to the common good or return to the common life, one must also look at the brutality of failing to return to the common life and that visceral otherness as well. Now, again, I want to stress this as much as possible. It's not to say that we shouldn't try to return to the common life, but there is also that visceral otherness of when one cannot help oneself and fails to return anyways. What do you do then? And so that's when you know, we talk about love and so on. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you, Daniel, in terms of like these aims and these pursuits. I would say, yes, go ahead, go for them anyways. But I think for me, it's just, I am very hesitant about putting or possibly putting distance of the other by saying some things like this, because, you know, yeah, but I think, yeah.
No, I think the key issue is when you say there's no normal snake, there is no philosophical normal snake versus a non-philosophical normal snake. In the same way that there is no philosophical normal or way that a human being ought to live versus not. So that has to be deconstructed, and I can get Foucault and all the post, and that's all very true. But there is the issue that there is the biological normality. So for example, a human being that does not eat is literally suffering. It's not a philosophical reality that creates the difference. It's the lack of food, shelter, the ability to figure out how to make their marriage work, the ability by which to be motivated instead of like bored all the time. And you see, that's all grounded in the concrete biological reality of the person. It's not based on a philosophical judgment that snakes that don't eat themselves are better than snakes that do, because that's all kind of philosophical, right? The snake that's eating itself is probably eating itself because it's dead, or it's trying to survive, right? Because it doesn't have any food, right? And so the experience of that snake is actually going to be to itself, I would assume, not so great, not because I'm judging it as not so great from a philosophical argument, but because starving to the point where you would eat yourself would be ultra miserable. And that's why, like with David Hume, and I'll take Rest going as well, is we need to stop judging the right society from a philosophical consciousness, the normal snake or the normal person from a therapeutic or a philosophical basis, right? But what David Hume points out, and then Thomas Sowell and all these people, is that smart people love philosophical judgments. They are really good at that language game, and that's what they're going to play. The guy whose job is to be a therapist and make people feel better is going to be biased to say that a good feeling person is normal and a bad feeling person is bad. Well, that's all from an incentive, right? You're letting your judgments be relative to the incentives of the field that you have a vested interest in that leads to mistake. And that's exactly what occurs. Like, you do have this, oh, you feel sad? There must be something wrong with you. And then that creates all sort of problems, right? Well, likewise, there's oh, this is a normal person. This is not a normal person. Based on what? Stay out of, you know, it's kind of like, that's where you have the political sort of decentralization. It's like, I have my community, you have your community, you do your thing, we all do difference. And there's got to be space for that difference, right? And in fact, the negation of the philosophical standard of normal explodes the diversity of the other. It forces the other to become more like, once you, the given is the normal. in belonging again. Once you get rid of the givens, that's the explosion of the others. There is no distancing now from the other, because the other defines your concrete lived experience constantly. And now you have to live with the anxiety of that. And if you, and that's when the temptation is to actually say, oh, normal people are happy, and then force all your neighbors to be happy. So it's easier to be around that difference, right? And likewise, it's like, oh, normal is Republican, like a philosophical premise. So then you make all your neighbors be Republican and you don't have to deal with the problem of the other. So the kind of negation of a philosophical normality opens up to asking questions about, hey, do you have food, neighbor? Taking care of the neighbor. Are you taken care of? Because even if you're really different from me and have radically different political differences, and I'm very different from you, I can't use that as a basis to say there's something wrong with you. I still have to worry about if you have food or not. So this is what people do. They use philosophical norms to justify not caring about the other because they have different beliefs. They look different. They have a different ideology. And in fact, if you get rid of that, just like Julie Rest is doing or David Hume is doing, that actually removes the ability to rationalize not being there for the other in terms of food, shelter, love, relationship, and all of these different things. And actually, then you also can't say, well, I'm actually bad at it, or my understanding of relationship is different, so I wouldn't want to impose that on other people. Oh, what are you doing? You're looking for ways to get around loving the neighbor or going and seeing the other person because I'm different and I wouldn't want to oppose. Oh, there is no normal. You can't use that excuse. So one by one, by going after the philosophical conscious or philosophical basis, you are removing barriers to the other precisely to meet them. And that's why there's value in that. And that's why I just, from my own personal, you could say, language game, prefer the emphasis on the common life. Like, that's because what you're doing is making space for the common life. And to me, that then transcends questions of positive, negative, optimism, pessimism, good, bad, because it's based on the facticity and the concreteness of the other person that you are responding to. And in responding to that, you have the possibility of the I thou. And it's only in the concrete, in the common life, that an I thou is possible. Therefore, the need to engage in these acts of clearing of the givens, of the philosophical basis that get in the way of that, of which is very, very anxiety producing. It is very difficult to encounter the other on those terms, but that would be where, as Tyler was saying at the beginning, you need to lean into the fear, because the one who fears is not made perfect in love, because fear has to deal with torment. But let me give it to Mr. Luber, Dimitri.
I want to first answer Javier's question. I think, like Daniel, I'm in complete agreement with what you're saying. So in my mind, how do you wrestle with Javier's question? So for me, it would be, if you're already looking, like in my mind, biological, I equate to like story. So if you're already looking at the story dimension, it's already presupposed that there's a philosophical perspective at play. So when you're looking at something through a philosophical perspective, you're not looking at it in a narrow enough lens to get to a story. It hasn't come alive, so to speak. So like like just to in my mind answer your question, it's that you have to keep in mind what the biological or story dimension is always pointing toward, like to get back to that ambiguity, to like see the ambiguity insofar as how philosophy is present from the position of being present, not from the abstraction of what philosophy is in this dynamic here. So it's yeah, I think that answers the question. And then yeah, like the quote unquote the navigation is the story. Like that to me is like the active element of philosophy. You can't have a succession of behaviors by just being philosophical. Like a succession of behaviors can only come after you're like not thinking. You're in a complete doing mode. So it's like you're saying, it's the negation itself that gives rise to the behavior, the succession of behaviors. But I really want to tackle the question. Well, two things. How to not, I like what you were saying, like how to not eat yourself. to me, we're always going to eat ourselves if we use the language like right and wrong. Like if we say, like, imagine a logic that isn't contingent on there being a wrong answer, and a logic that's contingent off of, I don't want to say adding, but being a part of being. So like the perennial, whatever that word is, thought, philosophy, if it's just being subsumed in what's already there, and like having a logic that isn't like, oh, 2 + 2 = 5, wrong. Like that's how you get to you. That's how you put yourself in a position to potentially eat yourself. So just to like kind of have that open stance of how is what I am concluding already a part of the schema, if you will. And then I was just thinking about like, who are you writing to? Like in your solitude, like when you're writing, like Dimitri, I like what you're saying, where you're like, I don't really want to have an audience. I'm not like thinking about the audience. But lately I've been thinking that when you're writing toward what you deem as valuable. Otherwise you wouldn't be writing at all. It would be nonsense for you. Like, so in that sense, there's this like greater pool of like what is value, and to have some conception of value has to be translatable to another person seeing that relation to value. So you're writing to the relation to value, and in that sense, that's where the communal ground of, that's where my audience is. It's the relation to value. So the question is, it's not about how do I make my writings more valuable? It's how do I make the relation more open for one to see how one may relate to it being valuable. That's like the key. And to me, like that relation that I'm talking about, that is theme. Theme is that relation that allows one to see that there is something valuable. Not that they think that there's something valuable, that they're seeing there's a relation. This work has something to do with some value. Not that the work itself is value, but that the work is relating to something that is making me feel and discover something that ends up being valuable. But the work itself doesn't say, hey, I'm valuable. It's just setting up the path, if you will, for you to walk and find if there is a value at the end of that path or not. Because in reality, you can read, like I watch so many movies where it's like, oh my God, I'm so in. And the movie's going and it's going, and then poof, I'm like dislodged from the movie. It's like I stopped seeing value. But that's not to say that I was never on a path to possibly discovering value in that work. So the work only is there for the sake of someone possibly discovering the value. And that's what you write to. You write to it being a clearing, so to speak, to use more Heidegger language. And then I wanted to say one more thing. Having an audience is like the same thing as having a politic, like having a certain political notion. Like for you to be part of a society, you have to have some political notion. For you to write something, you're writing it for the other. Even if it's like a journal for yourself, you're writing it for your other internal self. Like, oh, back in 2015, I have this journal entry about this profound experience. Well, I'm doing it after the experience is already done, one. So I'm reflecting back on another other of myself in a certain sense. And then two, it's written on paper for me, a future me, to then look back and reflect on that experience that my other me experienced. So like, no matter how you look at it, the audience is in, like, just to tie back, the audience, even if it's your own personal journal, is like, how am I going to relate to a possible value? How do I create the relation there? Oh, I forgot one more thing. Sorry. So like truth is in language, what Dimitri was saying. To understand truth is in language. But then it's like, okay, well, if you are experiencing truth, is it inherent that you're understanding truth? I would say no. I can't explain with words that like vibrational state, but I would still say because I experienced it, it's still within a truth, but it's not a truth that I can understand. That's the key to me. So it's like language is just in the realm of understanding, and truth is for me more contingent off of how one is positioned in an experience, and language is in my mind like it has a tyranny on how you are positioned in an experience. So like I do believe that there's other positions that are outside of language in the umbrella of truth. It's just the problem is when you experience it, you can't talk about it, because once you talk about it, it's concealing the truth. That's why I think like there's a difference between that vibrational state and language state. And like I get what you're saying, that like you can't understand that vibrational state without language. So like I completely agree with that. It's just the movement of vibration has its own different language, if you will, that's not language. And to me, that's like dance. That's like movement itself.
Can I ask you something about this?
Yeah, of course.
Because how actually I would agree that it seems like there's when we talk about those types of vibrational state experience, it seems impossible, right? Like if you just talk to a friend and he asks you, oh, I was doing Molly, well, you can explain it, but it doesn't seem to really get at it. So I understand that this is a kind of issue, but do you think that like that this very way that we are failing is constituted by language still? So it's like not a failure that means that there's something outside of language which is not a failure. It just means that as soon as, you know, as we experience this as linguistic bodies, that we go through a kind of failure of that is not possible without language. And because you said, well, it's a vibrational state, but then it's also a dance. So you're using another word here. So then, I mean, I could also bring in my words like, okay, this and that, but then we use more and more words, you know? You see what I mean?
No, absolutely. It's like if I were trying to explain to someone who Daniel is, it's like you're not gonna get it until you experience it. Like I remember trying to explain to my writing partner before he met Daniel, like who Daniel is, and it's like after he met Daniel, it's like he's unreal. Like, is this person even real? Like he's like a fucking genius, the kindest genius in the world. Like, and even that, it's like the feeling of like coming into something, like coming into language. I can see the argument where it's like that's just a byproduct of language, like you're saying. But there's something in what Heidegger talks about with thinking, like what you were getting at earlier, where there's something there is something provocative. There is something where you realize that you're not thinking. That moment of realization seems to be outside of language, because the language that's present seems to collapse. And like if it's collapsing, then there's something I want to say like fallacious about the language that's present. Like sure, you replace that fallacious language with another set of language, but the very moment of realization, the moment of collapsing, that movement seems to be outside of language. It's like you're searching for the new set, if you will, to take its place. And that searching mode is like you're not like ChatGPT and it's like, there's this word, what's the next likely word? Thinking. It's not like that. You're not thinking in terms of what's the next likely word. It's like poof, instantaneously, I see the next set. Like in the act of the present set collapsing, I see the new set, and then language emerges. So it's like there's something happening in the withdrawal that seems to be not language due to the fact that there's like a space where it's like there is no language present, there's just pure searching. And you don't search in a way where you're thinking of each word and the ordering of the word. You're thinking in terms of sentiments. And like sentiments can be filled in with like a seemingly infinite number of word combinations. So it's like when you're thinking in terms of sentiment, I don't know if that's just language. I feel like that's like feeling. I feel like that's just like, oh, that's what Molly is. Oh, it's that oh moment. Oh, that's who Daniel is. Genius. Like, you know what I mean? It's like I don't know if my rebuttal is rebuting, but I see what you're saying. I hope I expressed this like moment of non-language that I feel. Yeah.
No, it's wonderful. I'll give it to Dimitri, and that's very kind of you, Andrew. I appreciate that. That's there's a few things like that may actually help frame the issue. Is basically what it seems to me is that today people find themselves having to explain something that cannot be put into words, like you're saying with the kind of the Waffle House experience. But there are real stakes if the other person doesn't get it. This is the issue. In pluralism and globalization, everyone has their first principles, their understandings of justice and freedoms and different things that determine power, that determine economics, that determine if people go into extreme groups or not. And the only way to really stop that, basically, is to get people better at describing something that they feel like they cannot describe. The artist also basically is perpetual in the journey of trying to put into words something they feel like they can't put into words. And it also feels like you can get better at failing, right? But then the problem is, the more the complexity becomes of the world, the more you have to fail really, really well. And also even saying fail well can be problematic, because it's like, the way I like to think about it more so is it's like beauty in the sense is you are in fact experiencing beauty. There is a success, but there's still more beauty to experience. It's like you never get the whole, but you can get better and better and better and better in the different gymnasium, in different things. And so that, and the other thing that's so critical, you pointed out that everyone, like for David Hume, we are all now philosophical already. You're always already philosophical. Like it's done. Like if you're born in 2023 America, you come to think that America is about what? Freedom. Okay, you're philosophical. It's too late. And so because it's too late, for David Hume, the answer is not becoming non-philosophical. That is impossible unless you're going to be an Amish isolationist and never, ever interact with people different from you, right? So the question is, how do you do good philosophy, which somehow navigates the philosophy you're always already in without being nostalgic to get back to a simpler time or isolationist? For me, to understand the role of philosophy, you must look at sociology, economics, and the ramifications that happen in a world that is always already philosophical. Because if the world is always already philosophical, that means the world is always already in bad philosophy for David Hume, unless they are trained into good philosophy. And that then starts to speak to the philosophical melancholia that defines the world today. That is so problematic. But what does it look like? Because here's the problem. There's a ditch on either side of the road. Personal experiences of people getting sucked into basically conspiracies, fundamentalist things that had they had more philosophy, they could have had the mental resources to help them get out of. But then once they were in it, anyone who presented philosophy or arguments or thinking to help them, they immediately dismissed because that's impractical. And and there's nothing at the end, we all have to decide we all have the way that people basically, they say, I have my beliefs, I have my opinions. That's actually a kind of referral to a kind of ultimate sort of negativity, really, because you're saying, ultimately, we can't know anything. All I have is my beliefs, and I believe this guy is correct. And it ruins their life, basically. It destroys everything, like destroys families, destroys community, very horrific consequence that resulted to these people because of a lack of philosophy or the ability to engage in good philosophy. On the other hand, one of the reasons I disliked college professors so much is because they were these arrogant, very difficult intellectuals who thought that philosophy and thinking could save the world and they could make the world in their own image. That's where you need that negativity to come in because you're overly positive about ideas, right? That's the bad philosophy. Or like, and the other thing too, in the same way that you're always already philosophical today, you're also always already therapeutic today because of the positivity. And that's what I see Julie Ress as fighting against. And there's a danger there. But as there's a danger in being positive to the point where you think positivity is normal, and if you feel bad, there's something wrong with you or other people, and that has all the ditches. There's also a ditch on the other side where you say the more pessimistic you are, the more realistic you are. That there's some sort of greater truth in emphasizing the bad, right? Well, it's more like isness. Like, what is exactly the isness of things? Well, that's where David Hume's like, yes, that's why you concentrate on the common life, on the concrete, on the embedded, because that's the only isness you got that you then have to work for. But increasingly in a globalized pluralistic world, the isness is defined by complexity and philosophy and difficulty and people that are trying to manipulate you and people that are trying to control you. But since all of those people have basically been trained, the majority of people have been trained to think that thinking is a waste of time unless it gets you a job, or you're just a rationalizing intellectual who doesn't want to be practical, they then end up vulnerable and get sucked into ideology, conspiracies, fundamentalists, and their lives are ruined, right? So there's a ditch on either side of these roads. Philosophy makes you enter the philosophical melancholia that's bad, but the lack of philosophy makes you vulnerable to all of this manipulation. So how does one navigate the good philosophy that David Hume is talking about? Well, that's by making common life first. And philosophy is then in the clearing of that. Again, I stress, which we have no choice but to do today because you're always already philosophical. Due to the zeitgeist, due to globalization, due to pluralism, it's already done. So the question is simply, are you going to deny it? Are you going to isolate from it? Are you going to pretend it's not the case? Are you going to only hang out with people like you? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That is what we're always already having to decide. And that's the difficulty. And for David Hume, the only way to navigate this is with good philosophy, which honors the common life. But let me give it to Dimitri and Chetan as we come up on the close.
So it seems to be that negativity is getting central here in this conversation. And negativity is an interesting word. We can say, I feel bad, or I feel shitty or whatever, but like negativity is a logical category too. It's very you can use it for calculation and this kind of stuff. It has a completely indifferent quality to it in that sense. Now, Andrew Luber, I think we are coming more close because I'm just gonna say it. I wrote an article about this basically just a few days ago about this kind of collapse that you're talking about, this moment that it just collapses. And it was about the I, and you can say something like I am I, and you know what I mean by that, or I can say something like I equals I. Now, when I say it like this, I equals I, it seems doesn't seem like I'm talking about myself anymore, right? I'm talking about the I as a concept equaling the I as a concept. Now, we could also have a third one, and that's to say that I am I, but instead of saying that I am I as I am this I of the I equaling the other I. Okay, I hope that gets through because it's maybe a bit confusing. But the thing that I'm getting at here is that we have the singular I, the I which I really am. And then we have the I which equals the other I. Or in other words, the universal I, which could be any I because it is no I at all. No singular I. Now, this is quite messy, maybe, because it seems like the I can denote different things, and you don't really know always what I'm talking about when I say I. So there's some negativity. to that, but in every thought that I have, in everything that I say, I could add I think just before it. I think yada yada, I think B, C, D. So the I accompanies everything. In that sense, the I could principally accompany everything, and insofar as it does, or it could principally do that, as far as that is the case, the I is universal and goes along with everything. Now, the I also has this negativity to it, insofar as, if we want to think the I, that means we don't know what the I is. Otherwise, why would we think it? Of course, the I is like once at one time super familiar. I am I, that's the most familiar thing in the world. But if we want to aim to think the I, that entails that we are not satisfied with this familiarity, because we know that there's something laying behind this familiarity that is perhaps essential to understand what the I truly is. Not just the singular I, but what the I really and actually is. Maybe we don't know this. And the basic point I'm trying to bring across here is that all the negativity that we encounter on the way to try to think and try to know the I is also included within the I, insofar as the I just goes along. It collapses, but also in the next sentence I can say I think and I am and I equals I again. So it has a certain kind of efficacy that does not just collapse and then it's the end of the story, but it collapses and then perseveres again. It collapses and then perseveres again, or in other words, it actually perseveres in the very collapsing of it. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the I. The I needs that failure to be the I to be the I. And that's why I think in a nutshell how we relapse into language all the time, and that every way that we're trying to denote or posit or trying to latch on or grasp to a moment of negativity that is so elusive that it seems to slip away from language, if we look back on it retrospectively, we can see that it is actually taken up by language, as there is as a signifier. It has a certain place in my speech. Now, the way that this, I mean, the next question would be, how does this relate to truth, And like at the end of the day, I do think this is maybe not true, but I do believe that even though in my writings I've lambasted Kant a lot, and I haven't really paid the respect to him that I should and that I want to pay, because I think Kant is an exceptional thinker. But in a sense, Hegel tries to go beyond Kant, because Kant saw this thing in itself, which was a concept to denote the unconceptual. That's the only place that the thing in itself has. Well, for Hegel, it was like, okay, but bro, like, this is a thing in itself for you in language as a concept. So it's not you can't just put it at this end place where it sits in a static place and you put all that is unknown there. No, it continues to be taken up in, again, the symbolic order, or the way your conceptualization functions in a structural manner. Now, we could also say, yeah, okay, that's fine that you say this, Mr. Hegel, but what's then really out there? Like, what's really the not I, or the thing that escapes the I, the thing in itself as it is, as such, beyond any of our arbitrariness or language or symbolic order or these kinds of things. And I think this is a question that even though Hegel deals with it in a kind of in a certain way with language, insofar as he says, it takes place within language, I do think this Kantian point seems to be irreducible to Hegel, and that ultimately, at the end of the day, I don't think I don't think we can really say like, yeah, there is a thing in itself or there's not a thing in itself in this sense of it truly being out there as this kind of positive entity. But nonetheless, and that's a contradiction or maybe the contradiction, it lapses back into our linguistic games again. So I think that's what's quite funny about the I. And the thing is like that's actually the point I was trying to make across in my article, is that all the ways that you're gonna think the I, you're gonna have a certain let's say a bodily reaction to it, right? And Luber, you put this really well when you talked about the ambiguity. You know, once we feel ambiguous with certain concepts or certain new things, it's actually a sign that maybe we should go into it for that very reason that it is ambiguous. And I think that's for me like the reason to read Hegel, because it's so massively ambiguous. But then Hegel critiques Kant for when Kant tries to think the I, he stumbles upon the same paradox that you cannot think the I without being the I that thinks the I. But then I is both subject and object. But what's happening there then? Well, Kant basically tried to escape from this and found it very awkward. He complains of a feeling of awkwardness. Now, this is not really necessary, but the basic thing that's happening here is that in whatever way your metaphysics are going to be, it's going to have an actual effect on your spiritual attitude. And that the way that you think logically is not simply the way that you think logically. There's also affect involved with it and reaction. So, yeah.
That's a beautiful comment. And, you know, for me, what you're getting at on the possibility of the thing of itself, et cetera, so forth, you know, I'll talk about like the ultra-logical choice versus the absolute choice, this possibility of alternative being, and I would get into the possibility of theism, you know, near-death experience, all these kind of different things, but also would talk about alternative types of being that are beyond the horizon. I think you're right, that there is, for me, there ultimately has to become an ultra-logical choice that is still left open. Now, I'd have to elaborate on that, and I'm going to be a jerk and not. But no, what you were saying also about the I, like you can always add an I think or negate it or kind of fall back on it. You can always go different ways. Like there's too much of a one-sidedness to the language. Makes me think of where Ebert is emphasizing the repel, the freak theory, the attract, the repel, and all these different things. I mean, I'll make a great example. Like what do you do? Like Mr. Luber is saying so many kind compliments. What's the correct response? If I say thank you, I'm a kind of, maybe, does that make me an arrogant prick? Because I'm not like, but if I go, no, that's not true, there's an enjoyment in the disavowal, right? So what's the right thing to do? There's a ditch where people are unable to accept compliments. That's very problematic, right? But then there's another way where every time someone receives a compliment, they brush it off or they get mad, and that's not correct. But, you know, to some people, brushing off the compliment is the humble thing to do. That's what you should do. But to other people, it's like, oh, nah, they know, they're just enjoying the disavowal, right? Or different things. So what's the problem? It's entirely what? Abyssal. It's entirely a choice. You choose your response that you judge is fitting relative to the situation of the net, the ability where you know what you kind of naturally want to do is disavow it. It's actually more comfortable to say that's not true, and it's actually harder to say thank you. But for other people, it's easier to say thank you and harder to kind of disavow it, right? So there's this live situation that relative to different people have to be judged and determined that. Then there's like, that's the problem, right? You can always have, it's always one-sided. If you say you should always brush off the compliment, well, that's too one-sided because there's sometimes where you need to learn to accept a compliment. And then there are other times where, no, you need to stop. Like, you know how people are reaching for compliments? Like they're poking at people to say nice things. You need to stop doing that. So what's very interesting is what you see is the only way, like it's the problem where it's too one-sided. Like on the question of the I, right? It can always fall back, like Hegel will say. The only way to even begin to approach the issue is to take in consideration the entire situation that's going on, right? Like the entire situation of the net conversation, the kindness of the compliment, the way to respond, how it actually would be easier to disavow it. You have to judge a whole, not just a point, right? Because if you just judge a point, then you can always fall back. It's always too one-sided, right? It doesn't really, it's very difficult to get anywhere. So likewise, when you talk about, like we were saying last time, if you overly talk about negativity, then negativity can become a simile for positivity, right? Where it's good to be negative and bad to be positive. Oh, okay. Well, then it's just a game. What's the situation? The entire situation that is being discerned. And then you can determine if negativity or positivity is needed, clearing or not, accept compliment, poking, all of these different judgments. Oh, wait, a situation is a common life. That's why David Hume ultimately, when he's emphasizing common life, he's emphasizing situation. Philosophy must always be located in a situation that then it is making discernments relative to that. Here's the thing. You're always going to fail, because if you were to take this net conversation and throw it in front of the human race, 50% of people would say like, oh, he shouldn't have accepted the compliment. The other people would be like, he should have accepted the compliment. You know how we're saying there's an ultimate failure? There's always a failure because there's no possible action in a given situation that will be judged as the right action in every possible situation. But that doesn't mean relative to the situation you are making decisions in, there isn't a right or wrong or better or worse. It's just that it's contained to the situation. And maybe you do it wrong because there's no like check mark in the sky that says you had the right response, right? There's no X in the sky that said you had the wrong response, but that's like writing a book. And it goes to show that life is a creative act every single time. When you choose to respond X way versus Y way, you don't know who's your audience, the people at the net, what is the theme, trying to be genuine and trying to do what you think is best, or to be courageous, to risk misinterpretation, to risk misunderstanding, and the story is the perpetual unfolding of the net conversation. Ergo, that just applies to common life. Every episode of Common Life has a similar structure. So by analyzing the creative act, one can understand the phenomenological act. But that is an act that is fundamentally situational. That means philosophy must put that foundational, or else it's lost in a spurious infinity. The only way to get a true infinity in a Hegelian sense is geometrically. You have to have a situation, a circle relating to other points that then you are making a judgment in that cannot be universalized to everyone outside of the situation because they have different standards. But you have to accept that and make a choice all the same. Because
I have a question about this.
Please.
Because it's in the philosophy of nature, Hegel says time is the truth of space and spirit is the truth of nature. So what do you think about like spatiality as opposed to like succession in time and one-sidedness?
I think you're asking an $1 million question. That's why in the absolute choice we have to talk about, like, basically this is why I fall into like Bergson and Whitehead. It's time, space, and sport of space time. The incompleteness of space is precisely the possibility of the completion of time. Like what you have is, because you can't get a final point in space, that means what you're looking for is a completion in time, which ergo actually requires death. If there was no death, you couldn't have a completion of time. And you yourself may never observe or experience that completion, but you have to choose that that completion exists on the other, beyond the event horizon of your life in a Wittgenstein sort of sense. So the completion is the life, but you never get to experience the completion. What are you going to do about it? You're going to write a novel, but you're never going to get the confirmation that you wrote the best novel or a novel that people want. What are you going to do about it? You're going to live a life where the completion is found beyond the horizon that you're going to experience. What are you going to do about it? Are you going to face that? Are you going to choose that or not? So I think what we see in Hegel is the completion of spirit is in time, not in space. But time, of course, in being manifest in space, space is a part of time. But you cannot say, you can say that space is a manifestation of time, not that time is relative to space. Time is not relative to space. Space is a manifestation of time. And that is where you find completeness. But that means completeness is found in living a full life. And if you live that life fully, you don't get to experience it. So what are you going to do? It's like the creative act. If you write the greatest novel, nobody may read it. Nobody may understand it. So you're going to write it or not. You have to choose. Chetan, please.
Fascinating conversation. I actually wanted to talk to Daniel about the fascinating thing about common life, but I'll sort of start with the negativity bit in that sense and then sort of connect it back to what Daniel was saying. Quickly, I'll not sort of take much time. But I think one of the things with negativity, I think, emerges at the point that in Lacan, you have -1 and not 0. Unconscious in that sense is never simply an absence. That's why you say absence, presence, and so on and so forth. That it's not a 0. If it would have been a 0, we all would be psychotics. You know, there would be something which is permanently out of our reach and things would be over. But that's not the point. The point is that there is something which remains out of reach with any given discourse, any given language, any given grammar in that sense. So there is always a gap in language But that gap is, in that sense, always a site of negative one. It's never a zero in that sense, which is why the non-relation in Lacan actually is a site of very creative site of forming new relations. And that's the point of negativity in Lacanian frame, in that sense, that there is always a -1 at the point of the gap, not a zero. I think Luber's own sort of framing of the problem of non-language should reveal this. He's not saying a language, he's not saying unlanguage, he's saying non-language. Non as a very, very interesting opposition, that non is not something which simply says opposite or absence of that thing. It in fact says that how do you engage with that thing? Non as an opposition, let's say take a word like non-violence. Non-violence is not simply absence of violence. It's a particular way of engaging with violence. If you think about it, non-violence is not that there's no, you will always be entering into violence when you're entering into language. That's why it's not a violence. It's not in that sense. Non is a very interesting way to frame in that sense. That there is a structural gap in language, and there's no denying that reality. But eventually that gap always finds its manifestation in a given grammar, language, or in a given relationship or field towards the other. The big other in that sense, what Lacan would call it. Or, any, in that sense, a field of other, one can in simple language put it like that. That is why immediately you can ask the question that that this question of I, that a question of problem of I emerges precisely as a problem of -1. This negation inbuilt into the structuring of what Lacan would call, subject of enunciation, subject of statement, in that sense that the subject of enunciation is always placed at the level of the unconscious. It's always placed in the domain of field of the big other, in that sense. Language can't escape it. Language has to, encounter this split subjectivity at all points of time, or language originates at the point of split subjectivity all points of time. You can go back and read the Mirror Stage and, read those kind of ways to think about that problem in that sense. I think one of the very interesting questions that Daniel is raising for us about common life is exactly this problem of the split subject, in that sense, that once you encounter and understand that there is an ego placed at the level of what you call the identification of specular image, that axis of imaginary axis in Lacanian thinking. And when Daniel is sort of emphasizing common life in Lacanian frame, what Lacan would say is emphasizing the symbolic. Isn't it? That's what Lacan is sort of emphasizing upon, that the imaginary relation with the specular image can never ever give you the identification with the big other. The concrete big other. And big other is not only one big other for all frames. No. For Lacan, big other is a very concrete, particular big other that emerges in a particular language discourse, particular language game, particular grammar, in that sense. Yeah. And it is in that sense that if you look at the L schema and so on and so forth, what you get is that eventually you have to get down to the concrete symbolic domain. The problem, I think, I personally think of common life as a much better way to think about that question, to be honest, because I think there is something about the everyday, the common life, with which philosophy remains in struggle with also. Let's be honest about it to that degree. I'm in like this very serious debate with a scholar, Kantian scholar, basically. I'll not say who he is, what he is to me, and so on and so forth. Let's protect the identities here. But very, very serious kind of a debate in that sense. So there is this case happening in front of us these days where a woman has sort of filed a false complaint against her husband. Husband is really old, cancer patient, and the frivolous complaint, and actually it's a property dispute underneath it. And his point is that the identity of the male and the female is important to locate in that case, and that false complaint has to be located within the domain of patriarchy, the patriarchal relationship that existed prior to that. My point is that the minute you've entered into this filing of false complaint, not to defend yourself, but to attack the other person for something that you need in the sense of domain of greed, property, and so on and so forth, you've created an act over there which cannot be defended against the past patriarchal relationship between the couple. You can look at the same relationship in US and Ukraine also. What, I think Hirschmeyer, I don't remember the name of the person, political scientist, who's trying to defend and say that Russia is right in doing what it's doing. It's essentially the same argument. It's essentially the same identity argument that you were trying to invoke a certain past history to justify a certain very concrete action which doesn't exist, encounter within that domain. I think when you talk about affirming common life, if you're trying to think about in what ways philosophy can help us understand this, and somebody who doesn't do philosophy can actually immediately tell that there's a problem in what she's doing. It's very interesting. Somebody who has no relationship with philosophy can immediately tell you there's a problem. It's only a philosophy person can make that mistake. Similarly with US-Ukraine issue, somebody who's not into political science would get that problem much faster than somebody who's looking at through the historical past, complete relations. That all thing, in some senses, fudges the field in some particular way, which many times a common person can get immediate. I'm not sort of trying to glorify the common man or something like that. I'm just saying that there's something to that question, which philosophy cannot immediately answer in that sense. A lot of times that strangeness with that field or that grammar actually helps us encounter its truth much faster, and to encounter that same truth through the grammar of that discourse takes a very long time. And of course, when you encounter it through the grammar, you get much more clarity in that sense. And you're right that once you don't have the clarity, it's very easy to get lost. And is there another way to get that clarity apart from philosophy? That question is open between the spirituals and the philosophers. I'm not going to enter into that debate here. But what is it about any kind of symbolic, games that we play, that they can actually reinforce the fantasy over there, or the imaginary axis, or in common times reinforce our own bias and prejudices as much as they can help us question our own bias and prejudices. It's always a two-edged spot. It's never a single, I think, there's something about that problem which I think we need to all think about very seriously as who enter into this question of philosophy, because philosophy is a very dangerous game to that degree.
That was a marvelous comment. And I personally, you're exactly right that the symbolic and the common life go together. One of the reasons why I always talk about the common life is because we all have to change our language games. Every language game is incomplete, but the question is which language games might keep your eye on the ball, per se, or keep you more grounded or keep you from getting lost, because not all language games are equal, even if they're saying the same thing. This is the issue. There are many novels about the American West, we were saying last time, but not all novels are equal. Descriptions have consequences. Common life keeps my eye on economics. It keeps my eye on biology. It keeps my eye on engineering. You see, the issue is it's very, very easy when you have a language game like we talk about the symbolic. You may mean to talk about politics and economics and different things, but gradually the language slips into an abstraction and you lose sight of the common life. And so common life helps me keep my eye on the ball. But it is true that all language games fail. Like one of the things we talked about in the Science of Logic, or in the Hegel and Hume, is I think the Humean language game is incredibly useful. The problem is the Humean language game and structure in a globalized world ends up in fascism. This is the problem. And this is why I'll talk about the movement from Hume to Hegel, because the common life, so there's this thing where we get from the G.E. Moore, this is a hand, common sense, the defenders of common sense. You see this in the Scott Enlightenment, the counter-enlightenment, where philosophy usurps common sense and becomes idiotic because they take a long way to get to a simple conclusion that the average person can get quickly. But the problem is, in a globalized world where your decisions have impacts on people you do not know, the things that you intuit from your immediacy would intuit you in the direction of isolationism, fascism, or dominance of everyone else. And so you can no longer rely on the common sense as you could in the time of Hume. And yet Hume has a point. Oh, we have a problem then. How do you have common life provide the basis of thought in a world where your common life is intricately tied in with facticity in communities you do not know or other people you do not fully understand. This is where then intuition and common sense has to go through the purgatory or refining fire of philosophy. What kind of philosophy? What does that look like? The horror of the modern counter-enlightenment that I'll talk about, Hegel, in all of these different problems. But the key is the acknowledgement that the experience of common life is able to inform the thinking of a person to make better assessments that philosophy may never get at or is inefficient at getting at or cannot understand because it is from a place of abstraction. And so David Hume can help you avoid that problem, but then today you may overfit David Hume and end up with Duginism, basically, is what I think ends up happening. As much as I love the Scottish Enlightenment, the counter, I hopefully made that case in the papers and different things. It's one of the reasons too, like where we've talked about Julie Ress, I'm critiquing the negativity language, but I also understand that in the Julie Ress context of dealing with therapy, where you're constantly surrounded by making people feel better, we all have to pick a language game that will fail. And relative to that context, she is making decisions relative to what she thinks is best. The key is that we're able to read Julie Ress and not overfit. Likewise, can we read David Hume and not overfit? That's the challenge. But of course, if you don't overfit, that means you have to what? Think about it. How? Where do you start? What does it look like? You have to have 10,000 net conversations. You have to read, you have to think. Or you just say, screw it, I'm going to isolate myself and not deal with it. And that also, to go back with the example, what I was saying with Luber, like where 10,000 net conversations. Like you could go, oh, well, if Luber wouldn't have given you the compliment, you wouldn't have to worry about that abyssal choice, right? Well, that's isolationism. If I didn't interact with pluralism, I wouldn't have to worry about the choice. But that would actually be me being afraid of making an abyssal choice when someone gives you a compliment of either saying thank you or disavowing it. So what would I be doing if it's like, oh, it'd just be better if nobody gave compliments? You're actually running from the choice of how to respond. Likewise, isolationism is running from pluralism and globalization. No, you make a choice of how to respond. And actually, when nobody compliments you, then you're sitting around thinking nobody likes my work and everyone's me. Like that's the thing. Like when no one compliments you or likes your work, then you feel like your work sucks. And then someone says they like your work and you're like, no. Like we're all a walking contradiction, right? So instead, we have to, relative to our situation, get better at making choices to face those abyssal choices. Likewise, we need to face pluralism. But if you do that, then you must face philosophy because pluralism is fundamentally a philosophical situation. The question is how to do it and how to do it better. Oh, and by the way, if you do it well, there's no check mark in the sky to make you feel as if you did it well. If you write a great novel, there's no confirmation that you'll ever know in your life that it was a great novel. Maybe nobody reads it or it's dead from the presses, as Hume talks about. And it's only 200 years later that they understand the gravity of the novel. Likewise, there's only completion of time, but you may be dead. You'll never experience that completeness. So it goes with the creative act. So it goes with the novel, that no one may appreciate what you're on a life. And yet you choose to do it all the same or not. You have to choose today. The final thing I'll say is the following. One of the reasons this is so difficult and it seems to require this training is because if we use the debate between the language of Leibniz and Descartes, Leibniz says, hey, Descartes, you cannot speak about algebra being fundamental. You must speak about geometry, okay? Geometry, ergo situation. And what Leibniz warned Descartes is he's like, hey, if you talk about algebra as most fundamental, that's actually going to be very dangerous to philosophy. You need to talk about meta-geometry, not metaphysics or meta-points. Another way to look at this, Leibniz wants to say most fundamental reality is a situation, not a point. It's a geometrical situation, not the number 2 or 42 from Hitchhikers or different things. Here's the way to look at it. This would all have to be explained. The brain is naturally algebraic. That's what it naturally is. For most of human history, the natural tendency of the brain to be algebraic was not so consequential because you were in a situation with other people who had a similar algebraic thinking. Therefore, you could get along because you just happen to share the same background, right? As you become more globalized and pluralized, algebra will not do. And it turns out that it never worked. It never actually was fitting. It just was able to hide the fact that it wasn't fitting because you had similarity with everyone around you. But as you move up the plane, turns out you need to think situation. You need to think individual net conversation and how to respond. Individual common life, the situation of how people relate. You have to move from algebra to geometry, but the brain does not naturally think geometrically. You have to move from the I object distinction to I other together, but the brain always falls back. The world today requires you to think, to use Leibniz's term, metageometrically, which you cannot do without great effort. And the moment you stop, you fall back. Like the I falls back. It's always falling back. You're always falling back into algebra. You're always falling back into the I object distinction. You always are. But you must fall back less. If pluralism, if the political, if the economic, we have to get better at falling back, even though it's inevitable that we fail. And notice that this is a necessity of the situation of having different common lives that can never encompass them in their experiential horizon, having to interact and get along. That's the problem of pluralism and globalization. That requires metageometrical thinking, to use Leibniz terminology. That requires a movement from understanding to reason. Reason is not natural. Okay, in my opinion, the only way that you get better at thinking geometrically or situationally is the training of philosophy. Philosophy is what trains you to do that, if it is not the intellectual abstract philosophy that has nothing to do with common life. To think philosophically with the concrete is the gymnasium of the training of getting better at thinking situationally than it is to just think algebraically, which is more natural. And my thesis, my claim, is that this is what is required in a pluralistic, globalized world that doesn't just fall into Duginism. Maybe it can't be done. If it can't be done, then we will fall into Duginism, or just nation states will come back. They will end up in conflict, and we're already seeing that. This will not be avoided. This is what will occur. You will also continue to have a capitalist economic system that is based on external motivation, ergo mechanisms of capture. I will have to go into that conversation. But metageometrical thinking is necessary for the avoidance of this, or you can just say it cannot be avoided, or it would require totalitarian force to make it be avoided. Okay, maybe it naturally spreads in a kind of Hegelian sense where the implicit naturally becomes explicit and there's nothing to worry about. Don't know. The future's open. Well, if the future is open and all we can do is reconcile ourselves with that future that is open, as Dimitri was saying in Dylan Sean, the question is, what are we going to do now? The choice is abyssal. It must be abyssal, as the creative act must be abyssal. The question is, even though whatever you create, at the end of the day, there will be no check mark to confirm you spent your time well. There will be no circle you get to observe after death to see that it was complete. But there certainly can't be if you don't choose to do it now. You must choose now if you will engage in the creative act of the philosophical reasoning that there is reason to think there is need to train ourselves in concordance too, so that you may have a spread of that geometrical thinking, so that the future might be, who knows, less fascist. Choose today if you're going to engage in that or not. The future is open, and perhaps in the end it's a waste of time. Perhaps nobody reads your novel. Perhaps nobody looks at your painting. Perhaps you never make a dime from it. But it is precisely that possibility that it may all be for naught that makes the choice possibly a way to train us to be just a little braver. And leaning into that fear, leading in to that possibility of nothingness is precisely the cultivation, the act of which can cultivate the courage that, if indeed the meaning of life is courage, well, may have something to do with the meaning of life. Thank you. I've enjoyed this conversation. This has been a pleasure. Tyler, thank you for being here, sir. Dimitri, Jitan, Andrew Luber, Mr. Javier Rivera, thank you for your time, gentlemen.